Coming up in today's podcast.
You know, what's going to happen to all the people now who are faithfully executing BDH's orders? And we look at what's happening, you know, with the ATO and then business matters and so on. What's going to happen when all these people who believe they have been following BDH's wishes, when it all goes tits up and everyone gets hung out to dry, there'll be a whole nother layer of middle management that gets shamed and disgraced and knocked to the back. And this is because, again, what it comes back to is when you have the man of God as your true north, as your compass, and everything else moves around that, what it means is that when stuff goes to shit in the brethren, you have to have fall guys, because you can't pin it on the man of God, even if he's the one who set you down this path. And you see this happening, you know, it's about every 7 to 10 years. The man of God elevates a layer of leadership.
Welcome to the Get a Life podcast. Explore survivor stories. Uncover the hidden truths. Join our X-Call conversations. You matter, and so does your story. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Get a Life podcast. And we are back for part 2 of Excommunicated with Craig and Lindy. My name is Cheryl, and we are all ex-members of the Exclusive Brethren, now known as the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church. Welcome back, Craig and Lindy.
Hi.
Before we get into today's material, I have a few things that I want to go over. First, I want to remind anyone that's been a part of a high-demand religious group, especially those that were a part of the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church, to please follow the link that you see here and also in the description of the podcast to take part of a super important survey. The data from this survey is important for those of us that are going through the court system, and it's also needed to change laws. So I can't express how important this survey is, and I want to give a huge thank you to everybody who's already taken part of it. Secondly, in part 1, I had read out what had been mentioned in the PBCC meetings about breaking up families. And since then, I had some insiders contact me, and this seems to be a global image that they're portraying now. So it's gone from it was the devil that was breaking up families to now it's God breaking up families. And I want to read out what was specifically said in a different country than what I read out last time. And this insider sent me a message saying what was said was, the opposers say we break up families. Couldn't be further from the truth. It states in Genesis that God created light and darkness and separated between the both. So see, it's been happening for a long time. So I want to just pause here, and I want to hear both your responses to this, and then we can jump right into chapters 8 to 12.
That is terrible theology. I would just say that for a start. That is terrible exegesis of scripture, terrible theology. You can't take justification for the extreme familial and social separation that the brethren operate by. You can't take that from the creation account in Genesis.
Yeah. I was shocked when I read it, right? Because I mean, I had these little tidbits here and there that had been being said, right? And then to get the actual specific thing that was said in one of the meetings was just like, yeah, mind blowing. Yeah. And I mean, obviously the insider didn't agree with it at all, but yeah.
It's very true to how the brethren do their theology, and lots of other groups do this. They take one core doctrine or theology or scripture that to them has become the be-all and the end-all, and we know for the brethren that is separation, and then they read every single other scripture and interpret all their theological doctrines through that one thing. And even if it doesn't fit very well, they'll force it with a mallet and push it through to try and make it fit. And so instead of coming to scripture with an open mind, letting scripture speak for itself and taking into account different genres and different messages that the author and the human authors, as well as the divine author, were trying to get across, they're forcing everything through their particular prism, trying to make everything fit the doctrine of separation. It's also profoundly arrogant because it presumes that they get to choose who is light and to say
Yeah.
that they are light
Yeah.
and that everybody else is darkness,
Yeah.
which again, scripture doesn't say that. Scripture says that every human being has got darkness in them and light in them. Scripture's just nowhere in scripture does it just call a bunch of people pure light and other people just pure darkness. It's profoundly arrogant and profoundly ignorant.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah. I really wanted your input in it because I knew you'd be able to put it out in black and white. Thank you.
It reminds me of before we left, we were told that the world was a cold, dark, hard place, and that the only place we'd find love and compassion was inside the Brethren. And very quickly after leaving, I realized that the opposite is true.
Yeah.
And so the more they shout about light and dark, I mean, the increasing sort of extremist, the statements are getting more and more out there and more sort of extreme and definitive. And I think that comes from a place of weakness for the Brethren because they know they're not in control and they know that members can see what's happening on the outside and that there's an alternative reality and that what they're saying is not true. And so you have to go sort of further and further to try and scare people into staying within your group. So yeah, I think it's coming from a place of weakness.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Okay, so part 2, we're going to go through chapters 8 to 12. Maybe if you just want to give like a real brief overview of what these chapters we're covering in today are about, Craig, and then we'll just jump into to chapter 8.
So broadly, the first part of the book that we covered last time was dealing with the history of the Brethren and my upbringing and history and so on. And now the second part that we're going to go through deals with the process of coming up to thinking about leaving and that process of leaving and sort of the back and forth that's involved with that. So basically the 3 chunks are life in the Brethren, the process of leaving, and then life after the Brethren. So that's roughly what we've split it into. So what we're jumping into now is the process of I suppose questioning the Brethren and then what it meant to think about leaving and then actually leave.
Perfect.
Excellent. So I reckon if we just start by reading the beginning of chapter 8, that'll put us in a good place, I reckon. There's more chance of the sun not rising than the man of God failing. Those words echoed through my head as the man of God slowly made his way up the aisle of the main exclusive Brethren Hall in Invercargill. Hundreds of Brethren stood in hushed silence as the world leader, Bruce Hales, ambled in stately fashion across the green carpet. Loyal members guarded the end of each row of black seats to make sure nobody could approach him unannounced. What would those guards do, I wondered, if someone tried to push through? It had happened before, desperate brethren throwing themselves at the man of God to get his attention. He was God's voice on earth, after all. If you were struggling to get close to God, then getting close to his direct representative was the next best thing. It was a blustery Monday at the beginning of summer, several months after I had confessed I was gay. I was 18 and Bruce Hales had blessed us with a flying visit. 2 years had passed since my awkward encounter with him in Wollongong, and I'd been doing my best to suppress any doubts about him and his predecessors. He was in fine form during those Invercargill meetings, joking around with the gathered brethren and telling us how his father, the former elect vessel, had only tolerated black and white, no shades of grey allowed. Just an aside there, that's missing the entire rainbow. The local brethren had gone to extreme lengths to protect Hales from the media when he'd flown in the previous evening. To evade any photographers lying in wait, his private jet was taxied into a waiting hangar. He was then escorted in a van with blacked out windows. Decoy vehicles travelled in separate convoys, so nobody could be quite sure of his whereabouts. Such measures were standard practice wherever Hales travelled around the world. As the man of God was brought to the meeting room on the Monday, brethren were stationed on street corners to watch for members of the press who were feared and loathed in the church. A large white marquee was erected beside the hall so God's representative could enter and exit the van without being seen. As if that wasn't enough, Hales was tailed by a bodyguard. After the main service, I was among a small group of brethren who gathered in anxious silence under that white marquee for private audiences with Hales. could have cut the tension with a knife. One word from the man of God could make or break someone, and it was a big deal to talk to him one-on-one. My recently confessed sexuality had been enough to put me on the list, and now here I was, hoping he would save me. In a white shirt, unbuttoned at the top with its sleeves turned up, he seemed imposing, but also very ordinary in his sweaty humanity. There was no doubt in my mind that he had the power to wave his hands and cure my sexuality. As I stood there with my dad and Peter Hickmott, Hales held his black leather-bound Derby translated Bible and told me in a broad Australian accent that while he sympathised with my predicament, there was no future in being gay. Never accept yourself for who you are, he said. It was another shock. Instead of curing me, he was suggesting I needed to fight my sexuality for the rest of my life. He then instructed me to speak with a Brethren medical doctor, Roger Kirkpatrick, about treatment options. There's medication you can go on for these things. So that's just over 2 pages from the book, and even there's quite a lot to unpack. Painting a picture of even back then, and this was more than 15 years ago now, how paranoid Bruce Hales was, and that really strong sense of them and us, and the painting of journalists as being evil or opposers, and the massive hope that people, some of these rank and file brethren, and I was one of them, put in an encounter with Bruce Hales, where you are told that he is God's voice on earth. And as we talked about in the last podcast, Ethel Green said that he's Christ. And when you have someone built up in your mind like that, you expect them to be able to do Christ-like things, like wave their hands and change who you fundamentally are as a person. And so to me, it was quite a shock when that didn't happen with Bruce Hales.
And I can't imagine being told never accept yourself for who you are at that age. Like, what a jolt to the system mentally to have to process that.
Basically, you'll spend the rest of your life living in some kind of torment, fighting yourself for who you are, never accept yourself for who you are. You'll have to spend the rest of your life living some version of a lie. And basically, good luck. And the difficult thing with a lot of these interactions, and I mean, we'll talk about some more of them coming up, but they were couched as coming from a place of, we love you and we care about you. And here's this really shitty thing that you're going to have to deal with for the rest of your life. But it's really difficult to disagree with those things or challenge those things when A, they are coming from people who say they love you, and B, they're coming from someone who you have been taught to believe is Christ. There's no scope for disagreeing with that. And so I was, I didn't know what to do. And so picking up, Bruce Hales had told me to talk to Dr. Kirkpatrick, and so if we skip forward a couple of pages, I ended up following BD8 from Invercargill to Oamaru and then to Timaru, which is north of Invercargill. So we're in Timaru at this point. The next afternoon, I finally crossed paths with Bruce Hales again, this time at a local priest's modest 2-story brick home in Timaru. Once again, the man of God was in fine form. He sat in the living room, cracking jokes, whiskey glass in hand, being served the finest food and liquor as he was passed letters from local members one by one. These letters contained the innermost thoughts and fears of Brethren members who felt that appealing to him was their final recourse. Hales, ensconced in an armchair below pictures of his father and other previous world leaders, read and commented on them in front of the dozens gathered with scant regard for the privacy of the letter writers. He moved through them quickly, pronouncing judgment, giving advice, and querying people's circumstances. While Hales held forth, I was sent outside to talk to Dr. Roger Kirkpatrick. He often travelled with the man of God as a religious confidant and was on standby to help any brethren deemed to need medical help with a spiritual twist. Although many in the church felt more comfortable confiding in a brethren medical doctor than a worldly one, doctors were a rarity in the fold and were therefore revered. The few remaining had qualified before the 1960s ban on university education. being granted a consultation with Kirkpatrick came with the knowledge that you were speaking with the man of God's cousin, which gave an air of divinity to what might otherwise have been a routine medical discussion. That sunny afternoon in Timaru, Dr. Kirkpatrick lowered his portly 60-something-year-old frame onto a concrete ledge that ran alongside the driveway, partially obscured from the street by a green timber fence, and we talked in the shade of a large tree. His face was flushed pink, and I figured he'd been drinking. Of course, the hosts had been offering alcohol to all their guests. Kirkpatrick launched straight into grilling me about my sexuality. How long had I felt this way? Had I acted on my feelings? His questions soon became voyeuristic, and my skin crawled with shame. What had I done sexually with other people? How many times had we done it, and where? Did I prefer penetrating or being penetrated? Did I prefer a penis soft or hard? Kirkpatrick wanted to know whether I was sexually attracted to any brethren. Then he specifically asked whether I was sexually attracted to Peter Hickmott. That was one of the local priests from Invercargill. The doctor concluded by telling me my sexuality had to change. He said that because he was outside of his Australian jurisdiction, he couldn't prescribe any drugs. Instead, he told me to pray hard to God for divine intervention. The exchange left me feeling worthless and unclean. This had been no spiritual waving of hands, but rather an invasive journey through my immature sexual experiences and desires. I endured it because this was what the man of God wanted me to do. He had a direct line of communication to heaven, after all, so surely this must be the right path. My guilt and shame were my own fault. What else did I expect after committing such disgusting sins? Back inside, my skin still crawling, I crossed paths with Bruce Hales again as he prepared to head to the main meeting hall in Timaru, where followers were awaiting him. He asked me how the consultation had gone and told me he would be speaking to Dr. Kirkpatrick about my case. A short time later, at the official church meeting, I scribbled my notes as the man of God held forth. Hundreds of brethren sat around me in circular tiers in the windowless room, men and women separated under sterile fluorescent lights. Many of them, like me, were frenetically jotting down pronouncements that we thought applied to us. Change, I wrote on a scrap of paper in capital letters I'd borrowed from the person beside me. We have to change. Again, there's a lot to unpack there.
Much.
And the sort of the lengths that you'd go to and what you would accept and what you would be prepared to tolerate if you believed that it was what Bruce Hales wanted. And when I had this exchange with Kirkpatrick, I would never have dared question whether it was right. I would never have dared tell him that some of these things were none of his business. And there's very much, I think, in the Brethren, people are set up to take the blame for feeling bad. And a lot of the time when you feel like shit in the Brethren, it's not because you've done something wrong or there's something wrong with you. It's because you're being treated badly or
Or been
unethically.
violated
Yeah,
in a
or
priestly
abusively, whether that's physical or psychological or sexual. And often victims are sort of painted into a corner where they're made to feel like it's their fault. And here am I as an 18-year-old feeling sort of dirty and guilty as though I'm responsible for these feelings of shame. And of course, in there, when you have sinned, everything that comes from that is painted as being your guilt, whereas actually it's really important that the way you are dealt with and the way that you are sort of respected and honored with those feelings and that process, that can have a massive impact as well. And looking back, I do feel violated when I think about this exchange with Dr. Kirkpatrick.
Like that account that you talk about there it's such a active violation that goes on a lot, right? And so again, we appeal to those people inside there that if you have priestly visits like that and you get asked questions like that, you do not have to answer those. You can leave that priestly visit. You have the right to get up and walk out and be like, this is uncomfortable. This is making me uncomfortable. You have a right to express how you are feeling in that moment and walk out.
Yeah. And you have a right to have an advocate with you. You have a right to have someone else with you.
Took the words out of my mouth, Cindy.
Oh, right. Snap, Craig. Yeah, it's unbelievable, but you know, it's so hard, isn't it? Because 18-year-old you didn't know that. 16-year-old me, 14-year-old whoever else, 60-year-old whoever else, like you don't know. There's this incredible power imbalance, as you said. These people are viewed as Christ or as the cousin of Christ, or oh, he's a doctor or whatever. There's this huge power imbalance, and so you think that you have no boundaries and no rights, and that they can ask whatever they like. But yeah, hear us loud and clear, listeners. If anybody asks you anything and you don't want to tell them, you don't have to tell them, even if it's Bruce Hales himself. You don't have to tell them, and they're not mind readers. You know, that reminds me, your encounter there. I remember a similar encounter meeting Bruce Hales when I was wrestling and having doubts. And I remember at the time being terrified, thinking that, oh, he can apparently read our minds. Like that was something we believed. I don't know if like everyone believed that or if it was schoolyard talk that I'd picked up among teenagers and children, but like I believed he could read minds. And I remember, you know, him glancing at me along with a line of other young people and realizing he has no idea what's in my mind. And like, what a relief. And like there were so many myths we believed about him. My best friend, a beautiful girl called Serena, I remember she was devastated because she had met him before and her family was known to him, definitely, because they had a lot of trouble. But he paused next to her at some point and said, "What's your name?" And she was devastated because she was like, we believed that he knew every single Brethren person's name. Like, I don't know if you guys remember believing that, but again, I don't know if it was what everyone believed, if it was schoolyard talk as teenagers, but like she believed that he knew her name and she had met him before. And yet he was like, you know, who are you? What's your name? Like his polite sort of thing that he'd do now and again to make people feel special. But actually it devastated her. And I don't know, that's just a little anecdote. Similar with all this stuff, it's like he doesn't know what he's doing. They don't know what to do with a gay young man. They don't know what's going on in your heart and your mind. And yeah, viewing everything in these categories of black and white, sin or not, life is more complex than that. They're out of their depth.
Mm. And the other thing here is that the blurred lines between seeing a doctor and seeing a leader in the Brethren, like
Yeah.
for me, like Bruce Hales asked me how the consultation had gone and told me he would be speaking to Dr. Kirkpatrick about my case. And just for anyone who's in there and listening, it's a massive, massive breach of doctor-patient confidentiality for a doctor to go and discuss what you've talked about with someone else like that. And for Bruce Hales to just breezily assume, at least as I understood it from my interaction with him, that Dr. Kirkpatrick would tell him everything we'd talked about, in retrospect, is a massive, massive breach of a doctor's ethical responsibilities to a patient.
But
But that
again,
was
in
just
there,
par for the course.
yeah, exactly. When you're in there, right, you wouldn't even think to question that, right? Because those lines are so blurred in there that you wouldn't even think to question having a doctor speak to a priest or the man of God.
Yeah.
It's just, I mean, just about read this whole chapter, but we do need to move through it.
So much in this chapter.
Should we skip through? There's an interesting bit here about my grandmother's upbringing. So the chapter goes back a little bit in time. Long story short, I after that interaction with Bruce Hales and Rodrigo Patrick, I tried to run away, and I ended up in Christchurch, which is 6-7 hours driving north of Invercargill, and thought, shit, I've left the Brethren. And the first thing I thought about was I should try and find some of the relatives that I had outside of the Brethren. And I tracked down my two of my great uncles, my grandmother's brothers, who I knew existed and I'd heard talked about, but they'd been out since the 70s. And so, you know what it's like? There are just these shadowy names sort of at the edges of your family where you know they exist, but there are no pictures of them on the walls. And so for me, it was difficult connecting with them. So this was my first encounter talking to Charles and Ellen. My sudden appearance came as a shock. They hadn't heard from their sister for more than 30 years, and now here was her grandson out of the blue. I met them both later that day. Charles threw his arms around me in a bear hug, and my apprehension quickly gave way to relief as he said, "It's wonderful to meet you, Craig." Here, I realized, was someone who understood. Alan's children were particularly curious about who I was and where I'd come from. My cousin James, the same age as me, had grown up believing his Auntie Lottie had died when she was young, which made my existence a conundrum. When James challenged his dad on why he had declared his sister to be dead, Alan flatly replied, "She's dead to me." Uncle Alan, now a gruff white-haired cabinet maker and ballroom dance teacher, had often made it clear to his children how he felt about the Brethren. If any members of the Brethren show up, just slam the door in their face. But he was so pleased to see me that James was taken aback by the warm welcome I received. Alan's sympathy for my plight rapidly eclipsed any potential door slamming. Remembering his own rapid departure from the Brethren, he offered me $3,000 in cash to help me get on my feet, money he'd secretly stashed in the garage for emergencies. Uncle Charles, a jovial chemist with shocks of white hair and a matching moustache, had taken a more moderate approach to his sister's memory. His children had grown up knowing their distant Auntie Lottie was still alive, and once a year he'd raise a glass for a toast. "Oh, it's Lottie's birthday today." Like his younger brother, Charles was delighted to see me. My mum, just 5 when he was excommunicated, had been a favourite of his, even though he'd repeatedly told her off for bouncing on his wire-sprung bed. It was strange for Charles to imagine his 5-year-old niece having a teenage son. Gosh, fancy that, he'd thought when I called. One of Josie's children is coming to contact me. Also, like Alan, Charles bore the scars from their time in the Exclusive Brethren, and he was occasionally overwhelmed by the sadness of his past. In his early married life, he'd have such bad migraines that he'd need to go into a dark room and put a damp flannel cloth over his eyes. He didn't talk much about what was going on, other than to say that all his emotions were affecting him. A small thing could provoke a seemingly disproportionate reaction. On one occasion, Charles had looked out the back window and seen a hedgehog trapped under the fence. He had burst into tears and said, "Oh, it's the hedgehog. The hedgehog can't get out." His wife, Lynn, pointed out that it would be easy to rescue the hedgehog with a shovel, and the critter was soon on its merry way. But of course, Charles's grief went much deeper than a stuck hedgehog. Seeing the poor creature struggling to escape had brought memories flooding back of how he'd been trapped in the Brethren. So, for me, connecting with Charles and Alan when I went to Christchurch, when I very first tried to run away, was this really complicated first look through the window of what it meant to leave the Brethren. And it was clear to me, very clear to me, that even after 35 years, Charles and Alan were still deeply affected by what had happened. And there's that moment of realization, I guess, where you leave, or you think about leaving, and you think you'll get over it pretty quickly. And then you start looking around and you're like, "Oh shit, this is going to take a bit longer than I thought." And for me, then meeting my great uncles, and they weren't particularly, they seemed like pretty normal people, but it was clear that there was still this like deep undercurrent of trauma in their lives, and that was really complicated for them because, my Uncle Alan had written his sister off as being dead, and he had made his peace with that. And then suddenly her grandson appeared, and he was forced to reopen all of his emotions and how he felt about what had happened to him. And talking to his kids, my cousins now, about how traumatic it was to have me show up and to have all those memories come up. And they said when he started talking to me, it was the most they'd ever heard him talk about his life in the Brethren. It was
Wow.
just this massive thing that they didn't know about. And he'd never had family pictures on the wall. And then I came along and sort of poked it all up again. And after we had met, he pulled out a picture of his parents and put it up on the wall for the
Aw.
first time. But it got to his, he was 60 or so at this point, and it took him to that point to be comfortable putting a picture of his parents on the wall. And I just think about how complicated that is. And that window for me, meeting these relatives outside of the Brethren, was an eye-opener that it wouldn't be easy to leave.
That's such a beautiful story. And just as we can witness right now with some of the people that have recently left, and we see their pictures of joining up with their loved ones that have left, right? It's so, I can just imagine, right? I know that happened with me with my uncle when I met him. It does, it brings up this, what we tend to bury, because some of it we have to bury. We really do. Like we can't change the situation we are in. We simply can't, right? So some of this stuff we learn how to walk with crutches and we tuck it away. And it's such a beautiful thing when more of the family come out and you get together and there's this healing that happens. It's like this miracle in a bubble where there's just this healing energy that happens between everyone when they get to sit down and start reminiscing and start talking with especially someone from another generation, right? It opens up a whole other door for them to see through the eyes of that person.
Mm. Yeah, and that was like remarkable for me when I left. Like when I left, I was still young enough that some of my great grandparents' siblings were still alive. And you remember Auntie M, Lindy? Um, she was our great grandpa's sister, and she'd left like long, long, long ago. And talking to her experience leaving, and we were like another three generations down, and yet we still knew exactly what she was talking about when she talked about her childhood with our great great grandparents. Um,
Yeah.
and there's this shared trauma and this shared connection, and people know what you're talking about, and I think it gets really sort of can get really weird for partners and so on when you have that instant connection with other people who came from the brethren. Um, and that's a choice for everyone who leaves, I think, whether you lean into that and embrace that as part of your personality or whether you shut it away.
It's really important, I think, to make those connections with family, even if even if you might discover at times that, wow, this person's really different from me, they've got different beliefs, a different lifestyle. And sometimes you might think, actually, I don't really want to necessarily be close with you, which is fine. You have that choice, they have that choice. But as you say, Craig, there is this deep bond as well of a shared history, and often it's funny little things like a shared sense of humor, or just something that's kind of popped through genetically, a shared interest or something. And there is often this profound, deep sense of loyalty to each other. Like you kind of know, hey, if your back's up against the wall, this person would help you, and vice versa, because of that shared history, like that. Usually family is family. So it is
Mm.
important. I do, yeah, really encourage people to reach out to those relatives that they may have never met, first, second cousins, grandparents, siblings. Yeah.
And especially like for me, it was meeting uncles and aunties and cousins and my great uncles and aunties. And suddenly they started telling, they told me all these stories about my dad's childhood and my mum's childhood and my
Wow.
grandparents' childhoods. And all of this context started flooding in and painting this picture of who I was and what the background was. And I
Yeah.
remember saying at the time, like, I reckon in 2 years, I got to know my outside family better than I'd known my inside family in my whole life because
Yeah.
there was an honesty in how we interacted and sort of it was the good, the bad, and the ugly, and it was okay to disagree. And there was a lot of frank conversation that had just never ever happened with my family on the inside.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so true. And I mean, and you also talked about how some of them shared stories about Bruce Hales as a young man and as a teenager, right? Which
Oh
is
yes,
also,
what page is that on?
page 163. It's fascinating. Charles and Ellen talked about knowing Bruce Hales as you quote, a tearaway teen. Ellen had enjoyed visiting Sydney pubs with the future man of God, and my uncle had returned the favour when Bruce made his own trip across the Tasman. And yeah, they'd gone off to nightclubs and got thoroughly pissed. Think stories like that, and there are multiple stories like that actually, including from some people still in the Brethren, but they're really hushed down. Most of us have never heard them. But there are stories of Bruce Hales visiting nightclubs and doing things like that, and it's mind-blowing because Craig, you and I in the Brethren schooling system, when they rolled out their Bible studies teaching and that, like I've still got the notes of that from those Bible studies, and I can't remember the exact wording right now, but I'm pretty sure we were told like the man of God cannot sin and has not
Mm.
ever sinned, in language like that.
Been sinless since the age of 12, I remember being
Exactly.
taught.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so you're like, okay, how does that stack up with going to nightclubs and getting pissed? And like, yeah, it's just a farce. But so stories are important. History is important.
Mm. Yeah, in the process of this book, I interviewed a lot of people, including people who had grown up with Bruce Hales and his brothers, and people who'd been at their local meeting in Sydney and so on. And it was everyone who knew Bruce in his early days is just kind of astonished that he's become the leader of the Brethren because none of them saw anything spiritual about him. But here we
Yeah.
are.
Fascinating. The chapter finishes with you being given a special invitation directly from the MOG to go and live, right? To live in Sydney or have an extended stay in Sydney. That's
Yes.
quite unusual. That's quite unusual. I mean, it did Abby's been on this podcast and it happened to her, but it wasn't that common that someone actually got an invitation to go and live in Sydney. People were often sent on short-term encouragement trips, they were called, internationally, and that was more like 2 or 3 weeks to special meetings, special brethren conferences internationally, and with the aim of broadening their horizons, hoping they might meet someone and fall in love with somebody from someone outside of their own little goldfish bowl. But to actually go and live in Sydney, the residence of Bruce Hales, is quite the invitation. Why do you think they offered you that, Craig?
I think by that point there was an acknowledgement of how badly some of the things that had been playing out in our family had gone, and
Right. So
also
it
the
wasn't just the gay thing. It was this
well,
guy's
definitely the gay thing as well. And I think looking back, it helped that Peter Hickmott, who was one of my priests, was sort of rapidly rising through the ranks and was becoming quite a senior Brethren figure. And so he
right.
had the ear of Bruce Hales, and so there was a shortcut, I think, to getting his attention. And I also had, I had cousins in Sydney and other friends that I had over there. And so there were families in Sydney that were advocating for me to come as well and saying that I would be welcome to live with them. Um,
Right.
and
Right.
so there were a lot of things that just cleared the way. Um, and so I had run away to Christchurch, and long story short, the Brethren had tracked me down and sort of pulled me back in, and then offered me a trip to Sydney. And I think also it was a way of getting me out of New Zealand because they knew that I'd started connecting with outsiders, and they knew that I had found my uncles on the outside, and um, so we had to smash my mobile phone that I'd bought, so I couldn't call any of them. We had a little ceremony in the backyard at my cousin's place in Rangiora, and we smashed it with a hammer. But they moved me out of Christchurch really quickly. I went to Palmerston North and then on to Sydney. And I think, it was a privilege, as they couched it at the time, but really this sending of people on encouragement trips is just a way of scrambling their support networks and getting them away from people who could help them leave. And it makes you entirely dependent on the Brethren for everything that you're doing. And when I'm in Sydney, I don't know anyone in Sydney. I don't know the city. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know where to go if I'm going to leave. So it makes it much easier to hold me in one place. Just about read this whole chapter, but I'm trying to.
Yeah. So chapter 9 sees you arriving in Sydney.
Yes, and I think if we just skip to seeing Dr. Craddock, on a warm Tuesday morning, I was taken to visit Dr. Mark Craddock, another senior Brethren member. It was my second guided consultation with a Brethren medical doctor. My meeting with Hales's cousin, Dr. Roger Kirkpatrick, 2 months earlier, had been a dismal failure, but this was another chance for the man of God to oversee my treatment. Dr. Craddock, an older man with thinning white hair and a white business shirt, questioned me about my sexuality as we sat in the front living room of his spacious brick home in Oatlands. He told me he was sympathetic to my problem, adding that homosexuality is one of the hardest crosses a young person can be given to bear. He explained that unfortunately he didn't know of any medication that could cure a gay person, but he was experimenting with a different drug on another young person and waiting for the results of that. When Dr. Craddock asked what percentage homosexual I thought I might be, I replied I was 100% gay. He scorned this idea and I revised it, saying I was at least 95% homosexual. He fixated on this, telling me I needed to work on increasing the 5% of my makeup that was heterosexual. In the meantime, he recommended I take a course of Ciprostat, a hormonal suppressant that cuts off the body's supply of testosterone, typically reserved for cancer patients and sex offenders. Dr. Craddock told me that taking this chemical castration drug would reduce any urge I had to act out on my sexual preferences. He never explained potential side effects other than impotence. It didn't occur to me to question his prescription. I was seeing him under orders from the man of God, so I believed whatever Dr. Craddock was doing must be God's will. He wrote enough repeats for me to continue taking Ciprostat for a year without needing to see another doctor. And so once again, really difficult to draw the lines between what was a medical consultation and what was a spiritual consultation. And similar position with Dr. Kirkpatrick, where there was absolutely no part of me that felt I was able to say no or challenge what was happening to me in this exchange with Dr. Craddock. And because I was now in Sydney, in his jurisdiction, he was able to prescribe, whereas Dr. Kirkpatrick hadn't.
I see. Yeah, I was going to ask about that. Okay, so he was, because you were living there, he was able to prescribe it. It's also like, I mean, there's so many questions here, and I don't know how much to go into it all now, but so many questions. Like, I think this is such a picture of how the Brethren believe that they rule the world, that their flaunting of wider respect for wider principles and ethics that are held by wider society. Like, it's like he would have he been allowed to give that drug to somebody to help them with homosexuality? Like, has that been heard of outside of this guy doing it with you as a Brethren young person? Like, I'm just like, what did he think? When the years he gave you enough for a year, and then what would happen if you were back in New Zealand and you rocked up to your local doctor and said, oh, by the way, I need some more Ciprostat for being gay? What would have they said to you? I presume you've talked to some other doctors, Craig, since about this, and what there's just so many questions about it. Just feels like he was like operating like a little king in his own little world. I can do this. I can trial this drug with this young person. No, no trials needed, no safeguarding.
He would have known the side effects. You know what I mean? Like, there's no doctor that would just hand that out, right? So again, here's that disillusion between, I just need to fix this person to follow this set of rules and to fit into this mold that we have. And so if there's a drug to fix it, no matter what it is, at least we'll get him to fit back into this mold at the expense of what it could have done to your health.
Exactly. And all of these things that I didn't even occur to me to ask about the side effects, because there's such a trust relationship with doctors.
Yeah.
Like, even outside of the Brethren, you generally trust your doctor until you have a reason not to. So there are various exchanges with Bruce Hales described through here, but I think we'll just skip ahead and talk about when I went to dinner with him, because I still think it's funny, actually. One Sunday evening, I was invited to share dinner with Bruce Hales at a Brethren home in the suburb of Epping, where several dozen followers hung off his every word in the cosy living room. I was wedged between the larger-than-life man of God to my left and even larger church spin doctor Tony McCorkle to my right. This was pole position for seeing and hearing everything that went on, as I drank with Hales just as my Uncle Alan had 40 years earlier. The evening was jocular, with the man of God in fine form. He was drinking scotch and ice from crystal tumblers, just as Big Jim had enjoyed with his bacon and eggs. I watched in astonishment as Hales finished 5 glasses before dinner had begun. He could knock back whiskey faster than anyone I'd ever seen. He switched to wine as we ate, then continued drinking after dinner. I was used to heavy drinking among the Brethren, but this was the largest quantity of alcohol I'd seen consumed in such a short space of time. The man
Just
of God didn't.
just hold the line there for a minute. What have you just read? You know, like we know the brethren drink, but and I haven't been around Bruce Hales much, so I don't recall witnessing, like I had one meal with him and seen him drinking, but I wasn't counting the glasses and stuff. But like this description, this is a person with an alcohol problem. Like this is off the cards. Why is this normal? For Christ. It's just shocking, isn't it? When you just look at it, it's like, hold the line. How have we got used to this? How have
If I
people
tried, if I tried to drink that much whiskey before dinner, I'd be up to back spewing.
how have brethren and the brethren around Bruce got used to this? How is it that they have considered this normal?
Yeah, it's astonishing. So I think
And
the
also,
next page.
before you carry on, the Tony McCorkle thing, for any listeners who don't know about him, Google him and his story, or look up Michael Bacalard's book, Behind the Exclusive Brethren, where he discusses some of the Tony McCorkle stuff, because that whole story is freaking bonkers and it should not be forgotten. It's absolutely bonkers. And it's also evidence of just bizarre behavior by the Hales family and the brethren, with like it's recorded evidenced bribery of this man, huge sums of money, paying him to silence victims of sexual assault, all this kind of awful heinous bribery, hiding, covering up horrendous stuff. Tony McCorkle, look up that stuff if you're not aware of that. That is another massive set of skeletons in the closet of the Hales
I'll
family.
links below. I'll put links below in the podcast description with those articles in there.
Great. Carry on, Craig.
Thanks,
Sorry to
Cheryl.
interrupt.
That was a good interruption, though.
Yes. The man of God didn't appear to be drunk, but his face was flushed and he had grown merry. Later that evening, we gathered to sing around the piano, and Mr. Bruce, as we called him, belted out his favourite tunes. There was awkward shuffling when someone got swept up in the merriment and suggested we sing Candle in the Wind. We knew Hales had forbidden singing songs by Elton John because he was a gay degenerate. We looked to the man of God for We looked to the man of God for guidance, expecting him to admonish us and suggest a different song. To my surprise, he was right on board. Yes, let's sing that one. I couldn't quite believe it as I watched Bruce Hales, the man of God, break his own rule and croon along to Candle in the Wind. Alcohol consumption was rampant among the brethren in Sydney, where I was told the spiritual worth of a man could be determined by the strength of his drinks. I knew we brethren were heavy drinkers, but this was the first time I'd heard it so explicitly linked to our beliefs, with women also pressured to consume alcohol. One weeknight after a service at the main meeting room in Ermington, we spotted a police drink driving checkpoint on a nearby busy road. The family I was with called back to relay the news to the gatekeeper and asked him to alert fellow brethren as they left the yard. There was a chance people could still be over the blood alcohol limit from the whiskey they'd knocked back before the service, and drink driving charges weren't a good look. Best to take a different route home. This was just one of the tactics the brethren had for avoiding drink driving charges. At a dinner gathering in a private home, a relative of Bruce Hales advised that if we were ever in a crash and feared we might be over the limit, we should immediately go home and drink more whiskey, then tell police we'd had a few drinks post-accident to calm our nerves, making it impossible to determine our blood alcohol level at the time of the crash. Yeah, I was really surprised when I was living in Sydney at how heavy the drinking was. And this was even after an upbringing in the Brethren where we were heavy drinkers. I knew that. But when I was living in Sydney, alcohol was elevated to also a spiritual level. And there are like bits and pieces that I didn't include in the book, but one of my cousins in Sydney made a big point of telling me that you could judge a man's spiritual character by how strong he poured his whiskey. And that basically anything, if you asked for a Scotch and Coke, anything less than a 50-50 mix sort of raised some dubious questions about a man's character. And the
Man,
level
it makes me think. I mean, from what I've heard, people who are, deep into alcoholism, it does affect their behavior in that they do then start psychologically coming up with all kinds of ways to think about it, to justify and to hide the shame, or hide that they know it's wrong. Yeah, things to justify and kind of, what's the word? Yeah, it's
I mean, it's an addiction, right? And you talk to
Mm.
anybody who's got an addiction, whether that's cocaine, meth,
yeah,
alcohol, all the same. They all
yeah,
find they have to convince themselves that what
yeah,
they're doing is okay, and then
yeah.
make those around them also be
Well,
okay with what they're
yes,
doing.
yes. And so they come up with, phrases and cliches and justifications that they then, almost perhaps do believe themselves, and try and convince those around them as well. Like, there's that well-known phrase that we've all heard in there, of that classic one. And I believe it did come from Hales, apparently. That says, drink makes a weak man weaker and a strong man stronger. Well, of course, what a perfect example of a justification to say, hey, I'm such a strong man, I can drink whatever I like because it's just going to make me stronger. And of course, every other wannabe macho man around him is going to be like, oh yeah, me too. Like, let me show you
Yeah.
just how strong I am. It's
One
it's
of the
it's
one of the boys my age, the family I was one of the families I lived with in Sydney, um, had fellowship meetings coming up like weeks or a month out, and had basically started endurance training for these fellowship meetings by increasing the amount of alcohol he drank every day to build up his tolerance so that he could
Oh
impress
my.
so that he could impress people at these meetings by how much he could put away without getting drunk, as though that was an achievement to be proud of.
Oh, I want to cry.
Yeah, I believe it. And that's horrendous. You're literally just assaulting your system with poison just to prove your manhood. So stupid. Why don't they get into bullfighting or something? It's literally less dangerous.
It's just
Oh, that breaks my heart. Because you could see it, like, when you're in there and then you're out, that mentality of like keeping up with the Joneses. You've got to fit in that cookie cutter mold all the time. If you can't fit in that cookie cutter mold, then there's alarm bells raised, right?
It's that
Wow.
frog in the boiling pot thing too, eh? Like, I've probably shared this story before on one of these podcasts, but I remember when I first came out of the Brethren, and a family invited me around for a meal. And I said, oh, what do you want me to bring to drink? Because it was standard practice in the Brethren. If you went somewhere, you often would take a bottle of spirits with you as a bit of a thank you or a contribution. I said, what do you want me to bring to drink? And they said, oh, don't worry. And I was like, no, go on. What do you want to drink? And they said, oh, just maybe a bottle of juice or something. And I was like, what do you mean, like juice? Like, and they were like, yeah. And so anyway, when I went around there, and they literally served me like juice and water. And I was looking in the kitchen. I was like looking everywhere for the grog cabinet and for the glasses and the whiskey tumblers and the wine. And there was nothing. They had plastic cups, like, and that was all because they had young kids. That was all they had. And all we had was juice and water. And I just remember being floored because I was like, this is so abnormal. And I didn't realize that it was me who was abnormal. It's abnormal to drink like that at Sunday lunch.
Mm.
Oh, there's so many stories we could tell, isn't there, about the brethren and alcohol?
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that UBT sold breathalyzers to all the brethren with, UBT printed on them. I mean, that tells you a story in itself,
And
doesn't it?
I mean, if we go back, I know this was put in another podcast, but I'll just reiterate it again here is that, we had a recent leaver who have been a part of a group of women from all over the world who they were dry, like they weren't drinking. And that was this group that they
Oh,
encouraged each other, right? How to cook without alcohol, it was just a very supportive group, but it was worldwide. And Bruce Hale shut it down, right? And said that it was each locality's responsibility. It should not be done in a group chat. I mean, I have screenshots of this group chat that was it broke my heart when the final message of being asked to be shut down, it was shut down.
oh my gosh.
Mhm.
Wow.
And again, this has been going on for such a long time. Like we'll come to it later in the book actually, but one of my uncles, was withdrawn from in the 70s for refusing to drink alcohol.
Wow.
And the reason he wouldn't drink alcohol was because his grandfather had been an alcoholic. And so he'd seen the damage that it caused and he knew what risk there was to the family and he didn't want to go there.
Mm.
Um, and and he got withdrawn from.
Mm. Man,
Um,
to go back to your book, page 177, to summarize, even what we've just talked about, you say, I'd seen enough of Bruce Hales to have doubts about whether he was all that was claimed by the church. The drinking, the contradictions, the threats, none of it lined up with someone who was supposed to be an infallible representative of God on earth.
Yeah.
That is such a
yeah.
that's such a good summary.
Um, and that leads us to the next page, which is where you appear again.
Oh, oh, it's amazing that you had those experiences firsthand of being around Bruce and in Sydney. Right, okay. So here we are
Um,
halfway through chapter 9 and
yeah, so this section describes Lindy leaving. And I think this has all been, a lot of this stuff has been talked about on the podcast before. When Lindy left the Brethren, I was 19. Watching her make her terrible escape that summer profoundly affected me. She had been widely loved within the church, and I watched in dismay as the disinformation machine quickly turned against her. Almost overnight, she went, in the eyes of most brethren, from being a gentle, loving friend to an evil, godless monster. So I can't keep a straight face as I read that. Sorry, Lindy, because nothing could be further from the truth. Um, her grandmother, Anna, was one of the few people with whom I could have an honest conversation. I confided in her that I was also thinking of leaving the Brethren, and she listened as I poured out my concerns and fears during lengthy phone calls. Anna never judged me nor condemned me as a sinner for doubting the Brethren. When I told her I was wondering about life outside the church, she thoughtfully worked through what that might look like, as well as the associated benefits and sacrifices. Anna went to great lengths to protect her thread of connection with Lindy. She secretly bought a phone card from the local dairy so that calls couldn't be traced on the household bill, and she made excuses to avoid church services so she could call her excommunicated granddaughter while her husband was out. Anna would sit in her bedroom talking to Lindy while watching up the driveway to see Rob's car lights as he returned home, at which point she would quickly hang up. She also re-established contact with her eldest daughter, Kathleen, now known as Kate, who had been withdrawn from in the 1980s. I was still talking to Lindy too, in clandestine conversations my parents didn't know about, and we met secretly when I visited Auckland later that summer. Somehow the Brethren found out about this. The priest never addressed it with me directly, and there was no talk of my being shut up for contact with an outsider. But 2 weeks into the new year, I received a blistering call from Lindy's mother. She told me that her daughter was a liar and twister. It seemed a particularly cruel thing for a mother to say about her own child. Lindy, too, was ripped into for daring to maintain contact with young brethren still in the church, and when she tried to contact her family, she was accused of breaking up brethren families. Shutting up had become less common under Bruce Hales, but Lindy had dared to challenge the man of God's authority, which was still considered a grave sin. Poor Anna had pledged her support to me and Lindy, but lived in fear of what would happen if this was discovered by the church. Together, Anna and I agonized over how we longed to be freed from the brethren, but she told me bleakly that any window of opportunity had long since passed for her. She could hardly bear going to church services, so she went as little as possible. When it was unavoidable, she sat near the back and tried not to cry. In the end, we didn't spend long wondering what would happen if Anna's secret was discovered. I never knew how, but the brethren found out about her support for Lindy and me, and Anna, a great grandmother in her early 70s, received a visit from 2 Auckland priests who strongly reprimanded her for being a bad influence. During a distraught phone call, she told me she had been reprimanded for keeping in contact with us. We were both in tears at the sheer cruelty of it all. Anna was ordered to cut off all contact. This tactic was supposed to help keep me in the brethren, but instead it pushed me towards the exit. Of all the people who could have persuaded me to stay, Auntie Anna would have been the only one, and they tried to cut me off from her. This, I think, is really important. It's an illustration of that demonization of people after they leave, and I think it's such a fundamental way of how the brethren operate, immediately turning people into the devil incarnate. And I was shocked, Lindy, when you left, at how almost overnight the way people talked about you changed. And it was massively informative for me to see that happen and to know that the same thing would happen to me, and that no matter, and I see talking to people who are thinking about leaving now, and they talk about the connections they have with their friends and the connection they have with their families, and that those people won't cut them off. And they'll say, I'm telling, like, almost all of them will cut you off and start talking shit about you. And some of them will keep a pretense, or they might make a bit of a half-hearted effort for a while to keep in touch. But it won't last. And I often say to people who are worried about losing their friends, I say, well, the friends that you have in the brethren don't actually know the real you. And the acid test for your friendship is, if they knew the real you, would they still be your friend?
Yeah.
And if they wouldn't, then the chances are the friendship's not on a really good foundation in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting, eh? Like, again, it's that like polarization, eh? The like black to white kind of thinking that just happens so fast. And I mean, I look at my dad now, and I'm like, he was religious, he was like devoted, he was to the brethren, like he was highly trusted. He was completely trusted as a person, as the person who did the finances for the school trusts, all that kind of thing. His integrity and principles and that were respected. And yet someone like him, after, in his early 60s, after these decades of serving people and serving the church, just bang, no one believes his version of events in there. No one wants to give him the benefit of the doubt. I shouldn't say no one, because I have heard that there are a number of people who behind the scenes are going, we don't accept the brethren's line here that he's immoral and all that. But on the whole, nobody's contacted him directly to say, Steve, what's your side of the story? We know you're a person of integrity and principle. Tell us what's going on. Like, people just, it's bizarre. You're right. It's like a whole culture that just like closes in on the person, paints them black, tars and feathers them, and sends them out of town.
Yeah. If you don't follow the cookie cutter mold, right? The soon as the first step, I have never met a group of people that are so judgmental and full of gossip as soon as you walk outside the line that they have colored.
Really, I
And the
think
whole
it comes back to, it's a defense mechanism for them more than it is about you. It's because psychologically, they can't bear to listen to or sit with the truth of what's going on for you, because it holds up a mirror and as to their own reality, and what are they going to do with these false things that are coming to light, or they can't do it. So the only option to psychologically kind of keep hanging in there is for them to buy into that narrative and tar and feather you.
I feel bad for them. Like, I really do feel bad for them, because they don't know any different. They don't know what it feels like to be authentically yourself and to be authentically express who you are to somebody else, and then have that person fully accept you, right? You're born into that narrative, you're born into that mold, and you don't know anything different. Like, I do. I feel really bad for them.
Mm. And I think looking back as well, it was the nastiness of a lot of it.
Yeah.
Like, remember the way we used to gossip and bitch about people who had been caught in sin or had done something, even if they hadn't been shut up or withdrawn from. And they remember all these like nasty little sayings and rhymes that went around about people, and that was how we referred to them.
Yeah.
And there was no, like my grandpa experienced when he was shut up in the 70s, and he realized there was nothing spiritual or compassionate about that process of punishment. It was just public shame and a beatdown. And you were humiliated if you put a foot out of line. And we were nasty, and I remember being nasty. Um, and that was just par for the course. Like we talked one game over here and then practiced another one over here. So the rest of this chapter deals with me sort of realizing that I was going to leave and starting to make connections outside of the Brethren. Um, and we'll pick up at the end. At the beginning of 2009, 1 year after I'd been sent to Sydney, I planned a final farewell tour, driving 2,000 kilometres from Invercargill to Cape Reinga at the top of the North Island. From there, I spent several weeks working my way down the country, visiting people I knew I wouldn't be able to see once I'd left the Brethren, although trying to see Auntie Anna without the priest finding out proved impossible. Dad objected to the trip. I said that if the church tried to stop me, I'd stay in motels instead. This was another open act of rebellion, as brethren were only permitted to stay in other brethren homes. I wasn't quite ready to show my hand, and none of the uncles, aunts, cousins, and friends I saw knew this goodbye was final. They were still dancing to the same brethren tune. I was pretending to dance along, but had long since given up listening to the music. In Wellington, I stayed the night with Grandma Lottie one last time. It was bittersweet to hear her voice raised in song as she plucked at her Hawaiian guitar. One last hug, one last laugh, one last grandmotherly tut-tut, and I held her tight before she waved me off with her usual, "Goodbye, laddie." When I arrived in the whited upper town of Masterton one weekend, I was asked to preach at the Sunday evening service. The Brethren Assembly in Invercargill had stopped asking me to preach. It was clear I was troubled, but the good folks of Masterton knew nothing about that. This was too good a chance to pass up. Taking to the microphone that evening, I read from the 8th chapter of the Gospel of John, in which Jesus pours scorn on the Pharisees for passing judgment on others. He urges them to abandon their preconceptions. Again, therefore, Jesus spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. He that follows me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. True light, I preached, was made up of all the colours of the rainbow, working in unison. Diversity was critical, I told the graded brethren in Masterton. If we really wanted to find the light of life, then all must be accepted as equals. 5 days after my rainbow sermon, back in Invercargill, I called a meeting with the local elders. It was time for me to leave the exclusive brethren.
It chills up and down my body. It's just so well written, Craig. Like this whole book is just so anybody who hasn't read it, like when you read it, you just get so emotionally inside it. And because it's so, I mean, we've lived it. We all have lived this. It's just, it takes you on such a journey.
I'm still very pleased I gave that rainbow preaching. It was not part of my grand plan. I hadn't really thought about it. I just got up and said something. It was a perfect thing to say 5 days before I announced I was leaving.
Yeah, that is
Um,
hilarious. Yeah.
What
but
was the reception like from that meeting? What was the chatter around it? Did you get much feedback?
it was fine. I mean, none of them knew I was gay, and none of them knew that there was any underlying message, and none of them even knew that I was about to leave. And so they just kind of took it at face value.
Yeah.
Um, and it's true. Like even within the Brethren, there were all sorts of personalities and there was huge diversity of person in the Brethren. And so I think a lot of people would have just interpreted it sort of within their narrow frame of reference, hey, we should all get along. Which is also an important message.
Exactly. Yeah.
So moving on to chapter 10, the book goes back in time here. So we're moving backwards and forwards between my story and my family's story. And in chapter 10, we go back and start talking about my grandpa's story. So I've just got to the point of leaving, and now this is my grandpa's leaving. Almost 3 decades before I called my fateful meeting with the Invercargill elders, my grandpa George had his own run-in with Brethren leadership. In the spring of 1981, George was middle-aged, his hair receding as he approached a life-changing crisis. He'd become increasingly concerned by the hardline teachings of elect wrestle Jim Symington through the late 1970s, And by 1981, he'd stopped reading mandatory teachings from the North Dakota pig farmer who had assumed power in 1970. But George didn't dare share his doubts with his wife, Lottie. He kept them to himself, apart from very occasionally sounding out whether she had any misgivings about the Brethren system. But any time he gave the slightest hint that something was wrong, she reacted strongly in defense of the church. George agonized over how to address his concerns. Eventually, he decided the most effective path was to prepare a public speech at which he could speak out and say his piece. He waited several months for an opportunity to take the bull by the horns, feeling trepidatious, but in the end there was no grand statement. As George was leaving for work one morning, running a bit late as usual, Lottie confronted him with concerns of her own. She challenged him on why he hadn't been reading compulsory teachings from the man of God. Would he do that soon? George felt something snap. No, he said, and I'm not going to be reading those white books anymore, because Mr. Symington is the biggest rival minister of all. This was blasphemous talk. Rival minister was the phrase used to describe leaders who weren't completely subservient to the elect vessel. It was treasonous for George to be levelling such an accusation against the elect vessel himself. But George didn't stop there, saying he's the biggest rival minister of all because he's rival to Christ. Lottie was horrified. Well, I'm shocked to hear you say that, and I'll have to think about what to do now. Lottie, a bustling Brethren housewife with hair pulled into a sensible right-hand side part, didn't think about what to do for very long. Later that day, she called the local priests and reported her husband as a traitor. Two priests, Peter Heyman and Eric Boone, were on the doorstep that evening to interrogate George about his treachery. With the cat out of the bag, he felt he no longer had to keep himself in check and made his thoughts clear about the falseness of Symington's teaching. The wheels of Brethren justice moved quickly when it became clear that George would not back down from his blasphemy. A few days later, after a special assembly meeting, Peter Heyman knocked on the door once again, this time with grave news. George had been withdrawn from. The priest said, "The brethren have considered what you've said and the stand you've taken, and have judged that we can no longer walk with you in fellowship." The strangest thing happened as those words were pronounced. A great burden lifted off George's shoulders, and he suddenly felt free. And this is an experience I think that a lot of people who leave the Brethren will relate to, as you experience this terrible loss. And the chapter goes on to talk about George losing access to his children immediately. And even amidst this loss and this like terrible trauma, I think the worst trauma most of us will ever go through in our lives, even amid this trauma, there's that sort of indescribable feeling of relief and being free. And, this was the worst moment of George's life, and yet still there was something for him to celebrate in there.
Yeah.
And it's such a complicated mix of emotions. And I suppose I would say to people who are thinking about leaving is that leaving, while it may be the right decision for you, it doesn't mean that every day from here will be happy, and there will be a lot of sadness and a lot of pain as you work through the impact of this. But that's not to say that leaving is the wrong choice. It's just not going to make you happy every day overnight.
Mm-hmm.
The grief is real.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks for pointing that out, Craig. And it's I think it's excruciating to be forced to hide and to live a double life, and to have that sense of not being able to freely live according to what you believe to be right and good and true. That is a psychologically excruciating place to be in. And so while you might, in the Brethren, you might, have the joys and the comforts or whatever of family and friends and material prosperity, there's this psychologically excruciating thing often going on where you are, not living according to what you really believe. You're dancing a dance and walking a walk and talking a talk that you don't really believe in. And so I think that immense feeling of relief and release comes when, you realize you no longer have to dance that dance and walk that talk. It does bring an amazing psychological freedom. And yet, as you say, it doesn't mean everything's tickety-boo and everything's all rosy. But man, that's the beauty. I think that's the real joy, is not having to live that double life anymore, that so many people in the Brethren have come to accept as just a normal way of living. And your little story from before about Bruce Hales suddenly singing Candle in the Wind when he'd banned Elton John songs, like, to be honest, the guy himself lives with that double-mindedness, and with that, he clearly himself wrestles with the strictures that he's placed on his own life, that he then also doesn't actually really want to abide by. And when he's had enough booze, he lets it slide. He's also living with these contradictions.
Yeah, and I think the other point that's really important to make is, we're talking about the pain and heartbreak that is part of leaving. And for people who think that staying in there means you'll avoid that pain and heartbreak, that's not true. Like, the people who stay in the Brethren are living with just as much torment, or perhaps even more so. And we see people like my Auntie Anna, your Nana Lindy, and a lot of other older Brethren who have contacted me over the years and have got to the end of a life where they have just suppressed those doubts, and they have stayed in the Brethren to try and have a good life and to not lose their family and so on. And a lot of these people are getting to the end of their life having stayed in the Brethren, and are desperately sad and grieving for what their life might have been. And so,
life's been
there's
if
you feel you're not in the right place being in the Brethren now, those feelings aren't going to go away. And so your question is, do you want to live with the trauma of leaving and being authentic to yourself, or the trauma of staying in there and suppressing who you are?
Because it is excruciating. It is an excruciating choice. Yeah.
And I certainly have never regretted the choice I made.
I don't think people necessarily regret it. I think it's just learning how to balance. I mean, it is so bittersweet, right? It's very, very bittersweet, where you finally get to be able to explore who you are as an individual person, right? But there is a grief, there is a heaviness that you have to process, right? But with therapy, with support, there's tons of things that are available now that weren't available when I left, and I'm sure even when you guys left, right? It's so, you can do it. You can do it as long as you've got the support and you know what it is that you need and you're asking for help.
100%. So let's pick up here with a description of my grandparents' life, because I think it's important to run through painting a scene for what things were like in the 70s and 80s. So George and Lottie's happy home life set against the backdrop of fear and control. Jim Symington was renowned for his harsh application of assembly discipline. Brethren worldwide enjoyed a merry-go-round of excommunications and punishments. As a teen, I heard people my parents' age refer to the Symington era as a Holocaust. And just interjecting there, this is people inside the Brethren who were describing the 70s as a Holocaust. This was not opposers or outsiders. Often there was no logic to who was discarded and who was spared. Decisions were made on the basis of whoever managed to get on the phone fastest and put their version of events to Symington. George's mother, Ruth, my great-grandmother, recorded in granular detail how the elect vessel urged Brethren to purge their assemblies, get rid of the troublers. Symington had a crude leadership style. In the 1970s, as he reinforced the ban on university education, he dismissively instructed members who had already undergone tertiary study to piss on your degree. Some Brethren took the instruction literally. I still can't believe that happened. Like his predecessor, Big Jim Taylor, Symington became incapacitated by heavy drinking, and he was renowned for his love of raucous, whiskey-fueled musical evenings. As in Big Jim's day, alcohol was liberally discussed during church services. Why should you drink a gallon of wine when a cupful of whiskey will do you more good? At the height of Symington's power, he would hold forth at services in his North Dakota hometown of Nitchie, congregants clinging to his every word, then drive out into the countryside in his pickup truck and get plastered. On one occasion, a local non-Brethren farmer found the elect vessel totally blotto up a back road near Nitchie after a big fellowship meeting. Symington, the neighbour later told other locals, didn't know where he was or anything.
Wow.
Uh, Again, it's like this, the drinking is not a new thing. This has been going on for a very long time. It was commonplace for Brethren men to be thrown out of the church during Symington's reign of terror. Many tried to return with mixed success. The regular purges ripped families apart, leaving wives and children reliant on Brethren charity. The resulting divided households, mums and kids without their dads, were regarded as the norm during those chaotic Symington years. Women who abandoned their husbands and stayed loyal to the church were known as widows for the truth. They were stuck in marriage purgatory, forbidden from having contact with their former husbands, but also from remarrying, because that would show a lack of faith in God's ability to work a miracle and bring their husband back to the fellowship. The theoretical gold standard was for a person to repent of their ways and come crawling back. When Symington came to meetings in New Zealand, widows for the truth would queue up to see him basking in their newfound heroism. The devastating impact of having their families ripped apart was too much for some of the men, and in New Zealand alone, George later recalled, there were 6 or 8 notable suicides. In one terrible case in England in 1974, 41-year-old Roger Paynes hacked his wife and 3 children to death with an axe and then hung himself 3 months after being withdrawn from, which I think speaks for itself, really. The terrible, terrible things that have happened. For everyone who leaves and successfully rebuilds their lives, there are people who are kicked out and can't deal with it. We never really talked about suicide in the Bridgeton. It wasn't discussed. You didn't know, like vaguely, how many suicides could you have named, Lindy? Maybe 2 or 3?
Oh, I mean, suicides of people who'd left. No, you could only name 2 or 3, but I've looked into it in New Zealand, as have you, and there absolutely are, at least 6 to 8, and it looks like it's directly attributable to the trauma that people are going through because of having been separated from their families, spouses, children. It's not just that they were like mentally unwell or whatever, it's directly attributable. And I think, the blood is on the hands of the brethren and of the priests who were responsible for them. And some of those priests are still alive today. And, shame on them. Shame on them. Yeah, it's horrendous. But, as we know, there's been suicides inside the brethren as well. But it was definitely viewed again, just like so many other things, in a category of sin and of failure and sin and a lack of faith if you committed suicide, and it was viewed that a person would go to hell. And so on top of the horrendous trauma of a family dealing with suicide, it was they also had to deal with the shame of and this horrendous concept that maybe their beloved deceased person was now burning in the pits of hell for having been so sinful as to take their life because they couldn't cope with the trauma inflicted at the hands of the brethren. What?
And I know in some parts of the world too, there was localities where there were suicides where it was repeated that, the Lord took them before the devil could. Right? So it wasn't even considered a suicide. It was just that the Lord took them before the devil could.
Oh, so now the Lord's making people commit suicide to help them cope with the trauma inflicted by the.
We skipped over this part when I was living in Sydney, but one of the things Bruce Hales said in meetings when I was there was that it was better to die than to go on sinning.
Yeah.
And that was we saw this happen with his instructions for Braid and Lindy, your brother, where he said it would be better to end his own life than to carry on with the opposes. And here we are.
So you're like, I'm thinking of a struggling older mother in the brethren down south who tried to take her life. She was just sinning, was she? She was just, just sinning, and the Lord encouraged her to jump in front of a train. Like, what? It's unbelievable. That narrative
doesn't make sense.
The narrative is bullshit. It's bullshit.
And I think this is where I wish so badly that we had some way to help the insiders develop critical thinking and to be able to understand what critical thinking is and how to hone in on that to be able to understand some of the stuff that you're hearing, that if you could think through what you're hearing, you might be able to understand that, holy crap, none of this makes sense. There's so much contradictory stuff that's being told from locality to locality. I mean, even though there is this cohesive unit that spreads throughout, some of it just doesn't make sense. And because they don't have those critical thinking skills, right? And they're so robotically indoctrinated, they don't have that capacity to be able to understand some of the contradictory beliefs that are being pulled around in there.
It's a bit of a cheesy old metaphor in a way, but it does make me think of something like the compass. Like the people who have fixed Bruce as their true north, their compass needle is going all over the show because he's not true north and he's going all over the show. Whereas, the common thread, it's not just religious people or Christian people or not. The common thread in your book, Craig, of the people who have seen through this and left, they're people who had their compass set on something other than the man of God. They had their compass set on other conceptions of integrity and ethics and what's right and wrong. And so when you've got that ability to listen to your inner wisdom and your inner knowledge of actually this is reality and this isn't, then you can see that Bruce is not true north. Don't set your compass on him.
Yep. Yeah.
That critical thinking is such an important point. And I think there's an inability among people in the Brethren now to form a critical argument, or to explain what the actual underpinning of the argument is. And I saw, this was a couple of years ago now, but I saw some Brethren wading in on a discussion about the economy and politics and so on, and just came out with a statement like, such and such was the best finance minister New Zealand's ever had. But you drill down, it's like, but why? Like, what are the economic indicators that meant that that was good? And what do you understand actually about how the country's GDP works? What do you understand about economic measures and the different... This is a massively complicated topic, and there would be like professors and academics and economists who wouldn't be so bold as to make a call on who had been the best finance minister of all time because there are so many variables. And yet here was this young Brethren person like boldly proclaiming this was the best finance minister ever because this is what's been said by the Brethren. But there was an absolute inability to back it up with any data points or explanation of how this conclusion had been reached. And like for people in there that are listening, it's not like in the real world, it's not enough to just go out there and make these sweeping statements like we are the best and we are this. And like people don't believe that unless you have a critical base of sort of factual evidence and reasoned logic for explaining how you got to that position. You just sound like another idiot mouthing off.
Yeah. And that's the arrogance of the environment they're living in, right? And that's, again, I feel bad for them because they don't know any better. It's like the latest ABM video that just went out from UBT, right?
Yeah.
Right? Where they're so convinced that there's no other course that can teach them these skills, but this ABM course that's 18 months long, right? Well, yes, there is. Like you can't come to that conclusion without going around to all these other universities. Like you can't tell me Harvard doesn't have a better course than the one that the brethren have thought up. Like
there are universities that are centuries and centuries old. Like how is the oldest university? Like 800, 1,000 years old almost. And so you're telling me that over the course of hundreds and hundreds of years of carefully reviewing what works in terms of education and carefully developing curriculums and protocols and all these things, that those centuries of accumulated pieces of knowledge can just be overturned by your business course? Yeah, sure.
But Craig, if the man of grog hasn't written it, then it's just not going to be from God.
I
Sorry,
mean,
did he stand a frog?
but this is the thing, that the only people who believe these sweeping statements from them are themselves. And it just, like, to people on the outside, I'm not talking about outsiders, I'm not talking about people, sorry, I'm not talking about people who have left, but to sort of regular Joe Blogs, member of the public, it just sounds stupid.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm looking back at your page 198 here in your book, chapter 11 here. And, there's just two things that jump out to me that talk about exactly what we're talking about. At the top of the page, there's a comment from George where in 1977, Symington had made a statement about the media reporting on the Brethren, and he had said, "Sue the bastards." Yeah, sort of a bit of an infamous statement, really, saying "sue the bastards," and and many of the Brethren, went along with it and tried to do that. But you've written that George had a strong internal reaction to this advice, and he said, obviously to you or in writing, "That's not the spirit of Christ responding to an attack or persecution. That's not godly. This man is wrong."
Yeah.
And that's an example of somebody who had an internal compass that could critique what the man of God supposedly was saying and could go, actually, something's off here. And then yet a couple of paragraphs down in your page, you speak about George writing to his children, trying to make contact with them. And the children send back near identical letters. They've obviously talked with each other or received advice about what exactly to write. And they send back and they say, "This is to tell you, Dad, that I feel my home is with those in fellowship, with the Lord's servant, Mr. Symington, and it is the only place I think it is right to be. I would not be happy anywhere else." And that is three children who have chosen to align their compass with the man of God. And regardless of what it means, regardless of cutting their dad off, regardless of anything, it's like, no, that's them making a statement. I'm going to align my compass with the leader of the Brethren. And that's exactly where, going
And
back
there's
to
no
the
facts to back this up. They don't know that that's the happiest that they'll ever be. Again, critical thinking, where how you can't make a statement like that if you don't have the experiences outside of that experience, that statement. If you don't have the experiences outside of that statement to back it up, you don't know that. You're just going off by what you're being told. Critical thinking allows you to think beyond what it is that you're saying, go and get the data to back it up, and be like, actually, I'm not as happy as I could be in here. What if that is your response? What if that is the conclusion you come to after going in and having other experiences or taking other business courses somewhere else? You might realize, hey, I'm like missing out a whole other compartment of what I should be learning about how to run a business.
I was astonished when I went to university. Like, it was such a life-changing experience. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, they're going to teach me something? And then they're actually encouraging me to pick holes in what they're saying. And they're encouraging me to argue back. And they're encouraging me to, like, question the narrative and to come up with my own and say, actually, maybe this. Like, the principle of a university education was to really pick apart what you thought you knew and challenge other people on what they thought they knew. And that's the opposite of what the Brethren are trying to do. Like, there's a huge difference between education and indoctrination.
Oh, that's a good line, Craig. A huge difference between education and indoctrination. I like that. That's
another one that should be on a shirt.
Yeah, it should be. Yeah. And the thing is that universities aren't afraid of the truth being kicked about and questioned and challenged. Whereas if there's a group that's afraid of the truth being kicked around and questioned and challenged, that tells you there's something wrong. And you go on, and I hope Cheryl can put this in the links, but you share in your book then about George writing a letter and sending it to everyone in the Wellington Assembly, which is, it's a remarkable letter, and it's similar. And, when I read it, I was like, wow, it outlines almost everything that I was to write. Like, what was it, 30 years later or 50 years later or something ridiculous? When I wrote a letter to Bruce Hales in my early 20s. And then, yeah, but, page 199, George's wife, again, chooses where she's aligning the compass to her needle. She says, to George, I will be faithful to Mr. Symington. Page 199, and that's again where the axe falls. And the brethren are saying, oh no, it's the Lord doing this or it's the devil doing this, but really it's people making choices. It's people making choices to
And making
align
the point as well that this was in 1981. This was like 43 years ago now. This is not a new thing. And fundamentally, who the brethren are has not changed. They keep saying things have changed, things are different. No, they're not. But if we skip over, it was interesting for me hearing about my grandpa reconnecting with family on the outside. And again, this shows how long this has been going on for. George was nervous about reconnecting with his relatives outside the exclusive brethren. It had been more than 20 years since they were abruptly shunned by Ruth and her children when the separation edict was introduced, and George, feeling guilty and diffident, apprehensively started writing letters. He wondered if his worldly relatives would want to talk to a cousin who had cut them off, ignored them, and been scornful of them for so many years. But to George's surprise, his extended family reacted with open arms. His uncle Mick, Alf's brother, the same uncle who had been harshly turned away 2 decades earlier, wrote warmly to say there was no need for any apprehension or explaining. We harbour no ill feeling whatever and will be pleased to see you at any time. I think you have made a very big decision, but it's the right one, and I know it would not have been easy. News travelled fast, and soon my grandfather was getting letters from cousins who had heard the news. Words going round that George is out. He found it deeply emotional to reconnect with his non-brethren family, and a visit to Uncle Mick particularly stood out. George was blown away by Mick's useful knickknacks around the house, such as a hook strategically placed to hold the gate in position. They were exactly the sorts of things that George made at home. As he was leaving, Mick's wife pulled him aside and said, he's been quite emotional about your visit here because you're so much like him. Happy as the reunions were, they were tinged with sadness. George's Aunt Phyllis hadn't seen her sister Ruth for more than 20 years and was still shocked by her abrupt disappearance, which had caused her so much sorrow. Even after 2 decades, Phyllis mourned losing her sister to the exclusive brethren. Oh, I wish Ruth could be here. And I think this sort of nervousness from George, my grandpa, when it came time to leave, is something that a lot of people experience when they come out. Because when you're in the brethren and you are holding fast to the brethren doctrine, you can do and say some really hurtful things to people who are out of the brethren. And, the way George said, and we often talked about this, was, frankly, for 20 years, he'd been a bit of a prick to, like, they'd cut off that side of the family, had nothing to do with them, which is, like, in a normal family context, a really hurtful thing to happen. And I remember asking him once how the rest of the family reacted when separation came in. And he said he didn't actually know because separation came in so hard and so fast and they were cut off so completely that they never saw how they reacted. And so that feeling of sort of guilt and apprehension that can go with starting to contact people on the outside, where you're not sure how they're going to react. And then also the warmth of the reception from the family on the outside really surprised my grandpa. And it really surprised me when I left as well. That despite everything that had gone on, there were still people that were willing to sort of put the hurt of the past aside and sort of begin that process of healing and reconciliation and moving forward with a sort of partially restored family, I suppose. And it's really difficult when people come out of the brethren, when family members keep reappearing, because every one of them forces you to reevaluate your own experience and what your journey was. And my grandpa found this in 1981, that he came out of the brethren with his experiences and started connecting with all his uncles and aunties, and they themselves still had all of this massive trauma from what had happened to them. in their younger days. And his leaving sort of dredged all that back up for them. And this is all sort of documented quite articulately in their letters. And it's sort of astonishing to think of how many generations this has been going on for and how sort of familiar it is. The sadness of it and how they kept, I don't think they ever fully understood the separation and how the people who had come down on the exclusive side could just become so cold to their loved ones. And I guess the point I'd make there is that it's not normal. It's actually really messed up to have this kind of thing go on in your family.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah, so I'll attach a link below with the letter attached to it.
So the rest of the chapter deals with how my grandpa moved on with his life and how he built a new circle of friends and family and so on. And one of the sort of themes was it took him 12 years to accept that my grandma wasn't going to follow him out of the Brethren. He was so convinced that she would realize what a crock of shit it was. And 12 years of letters back and forth, and sometimes she would ignore them, and sometimes she would just send them back unopened. Sometimes the lawyers would write back instead. And eventually, after 12 years, Grandpa filed for divorce. And this is an interesting bit right at the end of this chapter, talking about how he tried to move on. While the divorce was a turning point, George was surprised over the following months by how difficult it was to move past his marriage, even though it had been 12 years since I'd lived together. He poured out his concerns in letters to friends. I find I still can't open up to the prospect of thinking seriously about looking for a new relationship. Several times I have started acting friendly towards a lady, but when she starts to show an interest in return, I suddenly get frightened and switch off, which doesn't do much for the friendship. George, in his 50s, fumbled around like a teenager as he tried to set a new romantic course. He reconnected with Nora, one of his former brethren flames. They'd both gone on to marry other people, but now, 30 years later, they were both divorced and excommunicated, and it seemed like an opportunity for a fresh start. George asked her to join him for dinner. Let's go out, for old time's sake. Over a meal at a nice restaurant up the hill, he popped a wistful question to Nora. Can I hold your hand? She agreed, but the hand-holding was more awkward than romantic. It was like they were kids again, and it was too much for poor George. In a subsequent letter to a friend, he reflected bleakly on the challenge of moving past his first love. Possibly, I am still dreaming that Lottie might wake up and escape. Lottie, like her mother-in-law Ruth, was far more affected by George's exit than she ever let him know. As she refused his letters and called in lawyers, she continued to wear his ring, a token of her status as a widow for the truth, even after they had spent more time apart than they had together. I only saw her crack once when talking about George. We were sitting at the kitchen table during one of her visits to Invercargill. I was a rebellious teenager, she a jovial yet deeply religious grey-haired woman in a collared blue blouse. Tears welled as Grandma looked me in the eye and said, "The devil took away my husband."
I thought it was the Lord who took people away.
Yeah.
This is so heart-wrenching. It's so heart-wrenching because these are families that are ripped apart. These are relationships that are ripped apart. These are people that's all they knew are ripped apart. I get questioned often about how familiar is the PBCC with the FLDS. And one of the questions that come up is, are they allowed multiple wives? And of course, it's not. They don't. But here is my response, is that Bruce might not have multiple wives, but he owns all those women that follow him to a T. Because if they find that their man or their husband or partner is out of line, they don't go to their husband and point it out. They go to a priest. In reality, Bruce does own all those women just as if they were his wives. I mean, yes, there's a few of them that get away, but I've heard multiple stories of, when these men are trying to, they're showing that, they've got some critical thinking going on, and they talk to their wife about it. The wife instead goes to a priest and says, my husband's struggling. instead of trying to understand what that husband is trying to say to them and maybe have some critical thinking skills together, right? So it is a sad situation because those, again, like we were talking about the relationships, how those relationships are very conditional. These marriages are conditional as well when they don't get to know each other as a true partnership. A true partnership doesn't call in a priest. It doesn't call in someone outside of it. They try and deal with it together as a unit. It's just
Well,
sad.
you've reminded me of something which is a very stark picture of that actually. Mrs. Kerr or Kerr, I'm not 100% sure how you say it, but the one who was the woman in question at Aberdeen, a girl from Auckland, which is the locality that I was from, married Mrs. Kerr's grandson. And this young woman told me that she had spoken directly with Mrs. Kerr at some point about the incident. I'm not sure what it was. And obviously, Mrs. Kerr's thing, to my knowledge, to the grave, publicly anyway, was that, was the party line, that it was all pure and all above board. But this elderly woman, Mrs. Kerr, told my friend, she showed my friend her wedding ring, which had 3 diamonds, and it had like a big diamond and then 2 others on either side. And Mrs. Kerr said to her that Big Jim had said, "This is like your marriage. I'm the rock in the middle, and you and your husband are the rocks on either side."
I'm
So
not
this was
surprised. Yeah.
only like 16 years ago or something, when I was still in the Brethren. So this was Mrs. Kerr reflecting as an elderly woman. I found that astonishing. And she'd said it like, what an honor that the man of God had said, that we were at the center of our marriage. Whereas I was like, WTF? What on earth is that old man doing the center of your freaking marriage? It's not an honor. It's really weird.
Yeah. I'm not
Very.
surprised. Like I'm not surprised by that at all. I mean, you think of some of the things that he was saying even in meeting, right? How the women are his, right? I mean, JT
Yeah,
Jr. really, and I get very, very passionate when it comes to the topic about Aberdeen and this situation that was made okay, right? Like it wasn't just that incident with Madeline. It wasn't just that incident with her. It was the stuff that he was saying in meeting too. It was all of it. It's not okay. It wasn't okay. And it should not have been done in a place of public worship.
But the point is like what you're saying there, that to be honest, today, Mr. Bruce may not say that, or the woman may not come out with a statement that obvious, but in effect, that is the truth. That at the center of every marriage is Bruce Hales.
Yeah.
He's the one who gets to call the shots over the marriage.
Yeah. And because the women are so placed on this echelon, they're below everybody else, right? That to be revered as, these men that just they want Bruce, right? Like they want to have this tie to Bruce Hales. And so it is very easy for them to portray their husbands and do what they're doing. But ultimately it is Bruce owns those women.
Cheryl, do you have a copy of the Brethren marriage vows as they are now?
I probably have it somewhere on my laptop.
Yeah. Do you remember how they went? And he was like, I so and so take thee so and so to be my lawfully wedded husband, wife, being committed to uphold in our household the principles of the fellowship as outlined by these great men, or something like that.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
It was explicit that your marriage was founded on your shared brethren belief. And so, like, I think the way the brethren look at it is if one of you walks away from the brethren, then that nullifies a part of your marriage void. Your first loyalty is to the fellowship, not to your spouse.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. Say that again, Craig. That's an important line.
I'm going to find an actual, I'll put it up here on the screen. We'll find it and I'll put it up here on the screen. Yeah. Yeah.
What was that, Lindy?
Say that line again. That's an important line.
That your loyalty is to the fellowship before your spouse.
Yeah.
So moving on, we're up to chapter 11 now, which starts with my grandpa experiencing the review in 2003. This was, But then it shifts back and explains what had been happening. And I think this bit is quite important because it deals with the Hales' rising to power. Um, the Brethren had been shifting in the years since George's excommunication in 1981. On a spring Thursday in 1987, Jim Symington had died in hospital in Minneapolis, diabetic, blind, and missing one leg. He'd had whiskey smuggled to him in hospital by loyal brethren right to the end, and the brethren had been thrown into a new era as members anticipated the rise of the next elect vessel. My great-grandmother Ruth offered prayers in her journal for a list of contenders, waiting, like other brethren, for a sign from God as to who would be anointed. The man who came out on top was John Hales, the Sydney leader who had first risen to power after his younger brother Bruce Hales Sr. married Big Jim Taylor's daughter in 1958. The Hales brothers had been treated like royalty because of their connection to the elect vessel, and members hung on to their every word. It seemed there was something special about them. However, while the Hales brothers knew how to turn on the charm, many brethren were terrified of them. Through the early 1960s, the brothers had demanded public confessions, with members urged to queue up and reveal their supposedly tawdry secrets in front of thousands of gathered brethren. Some of these meetings went on for up to 5 hours, and girls as young as 15 were pressured to confess. Those who refused were made to feel as if they didn't belong. The confession marathons were one of the only occasions where females were permitted to speak publicly in church, aside from announcing hymns or reciting their wedding vows. Anything involving sex or sexuality drew particular attention, and brethren elders milked these for all they were worth, reporting everything in graphic detail over the public address system. My own private priestly confessions decades later were bad enough, but this was humiliation en masse. It was all part of the Hales technique for bringing brethren into line, as 42-year-old John Hales described at public church meetings in 1964. Hurt him, hurt somebody, and then you'll really be effective. When you start to hurt people, you really know you're effective. John and Bruce Hales, that's Bruce Hales Sr., were unsparing in their cruelty. Their 53-year-old aunt, Eva Hales, gassed herself to death in 1965, following months of pressure to conform to brethren teachings. The Hales brothers were obsessed with money. John was an accountant, Bruce a time and motion studies expert who evaluated business efficiency, and through the 1960s, they took it upon themselves to whip brethren-owned businesses into shape, starting in Australia and New Zealand, and then spreading further afield. This network of financial control came to be known among brethren as the system. Members were ordered to record every minute of their days, with weekly reports handed to church leaders who reviewed how efficiently time was being used. When John Hales visited Whangarei in 1964, the city north of Auckland, where just a few years earlier Big Jim Taylor had told the brethren they must drink whiskey, he made clear how far he believed his powers extended. Some men, we go in their offices when they're out on holidays and one of their doors is locked. Well, he must have something in there that he doesn't want me to see, so I go looking for a key then. He's got no right to lock his doors, lock his cupboards. There was only one man with the power to stop the brothers, the elect vessel in New York, Big Jim. When he was hospitalized with alcoholism in 1965, his Sydney son-in-law launched what amounted to a brethren power grab, traveling the world to stamp his authority on brethren churches and businesses. John Hales, long considered the lesser of the siblings, aided Bruce's attempt to claim power, boasting to other brethren in private that he considered his brother's spiritual ministering to be at least as valuable as the elect vessels. He later admitted he'd given up on Big Jim's teachings. I had lost my taste for Mr. Taylor's ministry and challenged his guidance. When the elect vessel emerged from his extended hospital stay, he was taken aback to hear about this. He strongly disapproved of his son-in-law's attempts to control brethren businesses, and the Sydney congregation was ordered to a special disciplinary meeting at the Ashfield Hall. The Hales brothers faced a lengthy charge sheet: commerce in the assembly, dishonest ministry, injurious speaking, and, perhaps most damaging, the revelation that John Hales had lied to the elect vessel about financial matters. John, who was present at the meeting, acknowledged that the accusations against him were more than fair. The Hales brothers, pulled up red-handed, fell on their swords and accepted the punishment of being withdrawn from. Bruce acknowledged that he had been utterly cruel in his treatment of the brethren, while John wrote a series of groveling letters apologizing for the humiliation and anguish he had caused. I am grieved at the pain and suffering I have inflicted on the saints.
And pause there for a minute, because I hope, Cheryl, you can, I know you've talked about that letter before on these podcasts, but share it again. There's at least one copy of one of those grovelling letters available, written and signed by John Hales. And again, it's astonishing to read it, because we never heard about this on the inside, because how could we hear about it? It's admission from the man of God that he had sinned, that he had done wrong, he had treated people badly, he's repenting and apologizing. And how does that match up with this narrative that only a decade or two later we're being taught that he hadn't sinned since the age of 12, and that the son, it's more likely that the son would fail than one of these men of God would fail. But John Hales failed, he screwed up. He did some ungodly, awful things in his treatment of brethren, along with his brother.
I think it's understanding what happened through Sydney and sort of more widely with the Hales brothers, John and Bruce, and what happened with the system and what it represented within the Brethren. I think understanding that is sort of key to understanding who the Brethren are now. And when you think about, because John Hales was then withdrawn from twice again in the 70s under Symington, and the impact that it must have had on Bruce Hales, the current leader. He was a teenager in the 60s. He was born 1953, so he would have been 12 when his dad was withdrawn from the first time. And to have sort of grown up with your family at the pinnacle of Brethren power, and your auntie is Jim Taylor's daughter, and all of these connections, and then suddenly for it to all come crashing down when you're 12, and for your family to go from the pinnacle of the Brethren hierarchy to being mud for a while, and then to see, his dad withdrawn from again twice during the 70s. Like, Bruce Hales, BDH, knows what it's like to have your family ripped apart by the Brethren, because it's happened to him. He went years at a time not seeing his parents when he was in his, round about his 20s. Like, again, it's not that Brethren leaders don't understand the cruelty. The cruelty is the point.
Yeah.
And I still think, like, when you read or you hear about what Bruce Hales says, he's still obsessed with what happened to his dad in the 60s and 70s, and goes over it again and again and again and again and again, about how his father was mistreated and how it was wrong. And it's like, no, like, two different elect vessels, both JT Jr. and Symington, disapproved of what John Hales was doing and ordered him withdrawn from. And it creates this really awkward split screen for BDH, I think, where Sydney's his home and Sydney's the seat of power, but Sydney is also the assembly meeting that withdrew from his dad 3 times. Like, the Sydney Brethren were the people who knew John Hales the best, and 3 times they called him out on his bullshit and withdrew from him. And so it's a really complicated legacy, I think, for BDH to now be living in Sydney and what that means. And in a way, I think Sydney is where the control is the tightest.
Yeah.
And backwards and forwards. And of course, then John Hales did become the man of God in 1987, which was a great surprise to a number of people. The Symington-Hales transition marked another continental shift, with global control of the exclusive Brethren moving from North America to Australia. John Hales, older and wiser at 65, trod carefully as he seized the power he and his brother had been denied 2 decades earlier. First, his own ledger needed to be cleared. 6 months after Symington's death, the Sydney Assembly held a special meeting to acknowledge they had been wrong in excommunicating John 3 times, even though they'd been acting on the orders of 2 different elect vessels, and collectively repented for the grievous personal pain, suffering, and humiliation they had inflicted on the ascendant world leader. So this is a sort of one of the early rewritings of the Hales story. And I think it really, John Hales, as I see it, was relatively careful about rewriting his own legacy. But I think when he died, it really cleared the way for his sons, the next generation, to set about it in earnest. And I remember it being described to us, back me up on the theology here, Lindy, but talking about building the great temple, David and Solomon. And there's a lot of reference to David and Solomon made in relation to John Hales and Bruce Hales. Sorry, we're getting into the weeds on the doctrine here now. But how it fell to Solomon to complete some of the things that David had started because David was a flawed vessel. Or that David, I forget how it went now, got on to tie myself up in knots.
Interesting.
But basically the suggestion was that when it came to rewriting or correcting the Hales narrative, that BDH was Solomon coming along and finishing what David, i.e. John Hales, had started.
Oh my gosh. The presumption is just phenomenal.
Yeah. Yes, so skipping through John Hales' time as the elect vessel, as the new millennium ticked over, my parents fretted over the imminent death of the elect vessel. I lingered at the bathroom door, a curious 11-year-old, and eavesdropped as they fretfully discussed what the death of John Hales would mean for our family. In their eyes, there was no clear successor, and Mum feared the brethren would face another period of turmoil as potential leaders jostled for the top spot. My parents need not have worried. As the elect vessel declined in health, his youngest son, Bruce Hales Jr., increasingly deputised for him, and the ambitious 48-year-old soon seized control of local administrative functions in Sydney. His father, too weak to exercise power, allowed his son free rein. Brash and extroverted, with 6 children of his own, Bruce was a very different man whose paunchy frame revealed a fondness for fine food and liquor. He had experienced his father's rise to glory in the 1960s, then, as a teenager, lived through the shame of his excommunication in 1965. Bruce, a sharper political operator than his 2 elder brothers, knew which way the wind blew. He'd told Symington he supported the subsequent excommunications of his father in the 1970s and 1980s, then changed course to become one of his father's loudest cheerleaders once Symington was dead. A few months after John died in 2002, Bruce's moment came at Special Brethren meetings in Timaru, the South Island town where he would later direct treatment for my sexuality. He had had little experience leading Brethren conferences, and as the weekend approached, rank and file members watched intently to see whether senior leaders would offer Bruce the deference they had afforded his father. By the end of that weekend, it was clear Bruce Hales Jr. was the new world leader, and we soon came to refer to him as the Man of God, a new title for a new era. It was the second time in 50 years that power had transferred from father to son, and Bruce was the 4th world leader to claim a personal connection to the Taylor dynasty. Change was swift under Bruce. He declared a new era for the Brethren, a day of grace. No longer would the church be ruled by fear and threat, we were told, but rather by love and compassion. Part of this new day of grace was making a break with the past. In early 2002, Bruce's elder brother, Daniel Hales, was involved in erasing their father's archive. Daniel's sons oversaw the purging of their grandfather's paperwork by a document destruction company. They stood guard as 15 years of Brethren records, 2 pallets worth, were raised on site by a large truck-mounted shredder. It was important, Daniel said, for family representatives to watch to ensure that not a single piece of paper survived. This, going back in context here, John Hales had a very comprehensive filing system describing, it was sorted by locality and by surname. And so if you went to him and said Craig Hoyle from Invercargill, he could flick to Invercargill in his filing cabinet and then go through alphabetically to H. Hoyle. And then there would be copies of every single sort of letter or piece of correspondence that he had sent or received in relation to that person. And so there was this massive archive of Brethren history and assembly decisions and excommunications and that had happened, and it was all destroyed in 2002. A short time later, in mid-2002, Bruce ordered Brethren meetings worldwide to revisit all excommunications in living memory and to reconsider them in light of the new teaching on grace and compassion. This sweeping undertaking came to be known as the Review. Invercargill, a newly established meeting, escaped relatively unscathed, but the effects were more severe in larger, older Brethren assemblies such as Auckland and Wellington. In some cases, the people involved were now dead or details had been forgotten. Many of the documents kept by his father that Bruce's nephews had seen destroyed had concerned cases that were now being reviewed. It seemed he wanted to rewrite history with an airbrushed version of events that put the Hales dynasty in a good light. Families were wounded all over again as they were told their loved ones should not, in fact, have been thrown out of the Brethren. My grandma Edith had steadfastly refused to talk to her parents after they were excommunicated in the 1970s and had chosen the Brethren over her husband, Brian, in the early 1980s. Decades later, she received the shattering news that neither her parents nor her former husband should have received such harsh treatment. Sacrificing all for the church was a heavy burden. It was many times worse to be told the sacrifice had been wrongly imposed. The retrospective forgiveness was cold comfort to Edith, as her parents were long since dead, and her former husband was happily remarried outside the church. My parents' generation struggled to make sense of the new direction the Brethren had taken. They had come of age in the harsh Symington years, when even minor infractions resulted in excommunication. Now those rules were tossed out the window, and there were completely different criteria for getting shut up or withdrawn from. I overheard a hushed conversation between my mum and another Brethren woman her age, quietly voicing the unthinkable. Was everything we were told a lie?
I can't imagine what some of the families went through in there during the review.
It was awful. And I remember the agony that my grandma went through because she'd sacrificed everything for the Brethren and now she was told it had been wrong. And it's like, oh, we're like sorry that your parents died alone, and we're sorry that you couldn't see your dad when he was dying of cancer, and we're sorry that your husband has now been remarried to a second wife for longer than he was married to you. And like, there's nothing we can really do to fix it, but oh well, we're sorry, so that's the end of it.
It is unbelievable, absolutely unbelievable. The one thing that provided comfort to those families and men and women in the Brethren through those years, the tiny skerrick of comfort was that this was God's will and that somehow he was going to like be with them and bless them, and it was righteous, and that righteousness was on their side. And then this completely overturned all of that, and it was like, oh, hang on, it wasn't the Lord's will. That the priests screwed up. It just completely invalidated all their pain and all their narrative of being a martyr for the Lord. It just took all that away and then expected them to just suck it up and carry on.
I was talking to someone recently who was a more recent leaver than me, and they had been talking to their local priests and sort of challenging the narrative on some things. And there's always this approach from the Brethren where, oh, we know we got some things wrong in the past, but now we're on the right path. Now we're right. And this person was saying they challenged the priest, and it's like all of these things that you now admit have been wrong in the past, like, oh, what happened in the 70s and 80s was wrong. We acknowledged all this at the review, and now you're acknowledging things that have happened since the review that haven't been right. Is it possible that some of the things you are doing right now aren't right? And that seems to be the barrier for the Brethren, and certainly those who are deeply invested in the doctrine, is like they're prepared to admit that things were wrong in the past, but they do not have the humility to consider that some things may not be right now.
This is some of the stuff that's coming at me from insiders right now. This is the thing that boggles them and gets them the exact same thing. because they're tightening down again on a lot of things. And everybody knows it's wrong. We have this review and we have all this stuff that's happening. And here we are in the same pot of soup all over again, but nobody can see it. Right. But because it wasn't, that review was not done authentically. Right. Had it been done authentically, right, you would learn from that and be able to apply it to what's happening right now. But because it wasn't, it was just Bruce bringing people into the candy store, locking it behind them, right, and making it seem like it's this whole different place. Right. They're not seeing through it to be able to understand, well, what could we be doing wrong right now?
And I felt there was a part of me who felt sorry for some of the leaders that were hauled over the coals during the review, because they were doing what they were told. And Lindy, there was a case of one of the really prominent leaders in New Zealand who got told that they had to put right what they'd done to so and so when they withdrew from them. And this priest refused and said, I'm not saying sorry for that. I did exactly what John Hales told me to do. And here's the letter from John Hales where he told me to do it. And this priest then got shut up. So, and I think a lot of people were placed in that position. People like your Uncle Harold, for instance, who, yes, had done some terrible things in their enforcement of Brethren doctrine, but ultimately the people, those leaders who were enforcing things under Symington and then John Hales, for all their faults, they did believe they were doing the right thing. And then to suddenly, what's going to happen to all the people now who are faithfully executing BDH's orders? And we look at what's happening, with the ATO and then business matters and so on. What's going to happen when all these people who believe they have been following BDH's wishes, when it all goes tits up and everyone gets hung out to dry, there'll be a whole nother layer of middle management that gets shamed and disgraced and knocked to the back. And this is because, again, what it comes back to is when you have the man of God as your true north, as your compass, and everything else moves around that, what it means is that when stuff goes to shit in the brethren, you have to have fall guys, because you can't pin it on the man of God, even if he's the one who set you down this path. And you see this happening, it's about every 7 to 10 years. The man of God elevates a layer of leadership. And I mean, we saw this happen with the review. The review was a really convenient way of knocking out all of the previous leadership, in particular the older leaders who had some idea of what had been going on and knew a lot of the history. And I think this review under BDH, so it was like a forest fire that sort of cleared the way for this fresh leadership to come up, where sort of largely people in their 60s were replaced by people in their 40s. And that's a gross overgeneralization. I know it's not quite that simple. But, that layer of middle management under the man of God does get periodic, people get cycled through those roles. You rise up and you fall out of favor. And it's a pattern that's been repeating over and over and over. And all these people at the top who are enforcing all of these sort of financial matters and so on, like, there will be another cycle where the fall guys fall, and then a new level of middle management will come up through the brethren ranks. And it makes sense for the man of God to, you want your leaders younger. The younger, the better. Like your middle manager leaders. The older ones that have been through this before. When you think about it, people, if you're picking 30-year-olds to start taking responsibility in the meetings, 30-year-olds don't really even remember what happened in the review, let alone what happened under John Hales or what happened under Symington. The younger people are, the more likely they are to just uncritically accept what the man of God is saying. And I remember that conversation happening among teenagers and people in the early 20s when I was in there. And we would hear about older people like expressing doubt. And the view from the younger people was that it was our job to call out these older people for having doubts, which is just such an incredibly disrespectful attitude to have towards your elders,
Yeah.
who have been there and seen it all before.
Yeah. Yeah. Really, really arrogant. But there was like along with that, you're right, Craig, there was this sense of like, well, those old guys, yeah, they screwed up. They're like there was a derision, like a looking down on them, a despising of them. And then, yeah, and with the younger ones coming up, there was this arrogance of oh, well, we're loyal, we know what's best. It was this twin combination, right, of like looking down on them and devaluing their experiences, and an incredible arrogance and naivety that actually we are going to, over the next decade or two, experience exactly the same thing, most likely. Bruce is in his 70s now. In our lifetime, probably in the next shortish while, actually, to be honest, we might experience a change in leadership with him there. And again, this political wrestling of who's going to step into his shoes and whether it's his boys or others. And along with that, guarantee you there'll be a massive global change in leadership as well, just the same as we've seen with every single time it's changed. A key leader's changed, and it just keeps going, doesn't it?
Yeah, there was a lot of talk in the Brethren about how the young people are our future. And that is true. Young people are always the future, but it's also the older people in any society or community that hold the collective history and the
Yeah.
knowledge and the guardrails to say, hey, we've been here before. And it's such a cliche, but there's so much knowledge that we get from older people in our communities and the people who have gone before us and what we can learn from their experiences. And I think a lot of that gets sidelined in the Brethren. There's not that attitude of learning from elders, and it means that you lose a lot of the context. And a lot of older people in the Brethren are reluctant to talk about the past because it doesn't align with
Yeah.
the current teaching.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it all just perpetuates, right? Because they don't want to talk about it because it's seen as casting doubt on the current narrative. And so then it just never gets talked about. So the upcoming generation has no idea. And but yeah, there is this massive culture of disrespect for what's gone before and for the leaders who have gone before. And it's totally a hangover from exactly how Bruce treated people when he came into power and that disrespect that he had of the older crew. It's a massively powerful cultural thing in there, and it's dangerous.
I sometimes sit here and hope that the people who sit and watch all these podcasts that have to they're instructed to make sure that they keep on top of listening to what we're saying. I hope just one of them starts being able to listen to this enough and be like, oh, actually, that was kind of a good point. And some puzzle pieces start lining up and you see through this because I mean, especially this podcast, it has been so lined up to be able to spot how this whole system is working, right? And if you have just an ounce of critical thinking, you're going to be able to see through the complete and utter facade that you are being a servant to, right? Like you are not serving yourself. You're not serving the Lord. You are not serving what you think you are serving. You are serving a system that serves one elite group. That is it. So yes, to the person who is watching this right now for that group, just hear us. Like we're not coming on here to be bitter. We literally are laying it out. I actually have such empathy and heartfelt desire that you can see through this. Yeah.
And we have all been where you are for those insiders.
Yeah.
We've all been through these thoughts and these emotions, and this journey is one that we've all walked. And so I just think it's good as well, talking about the swings and the roundabouts, and it loosens up and then it tightens, and it loosens up and then it tightens again, which has been going on for a very long time. And in May 2003, just a few days before my 14th birthday, Bruce Hales Jr., furious that the Brethren had taken advantage of his day of grace, cracked down on wayward followers with a scathing letter It tore strips off members for their repeated rule breaking and listed unacceptable features that had crept in. Unsuitable hairstyles, e.g., sideburns and long hair, brothers, hair tinting, attending venues of worldly entertainment, including restaurants, pre-recorded music, CDs, digital equipment, mobile phones. The man of God demanded public declarations of loyalty. Brethren in every locality should declare themselves in the assembly in a conclusive manner that will leave no doubt that the regulation and control required will be respected and upheld without compromise. The letter was an explicit reprimand from the man of God himself, with the implicit threat of excommunication for anyone who did not comply. It was read out repeatedly at meetings. At one tenth gathering in Invercargill, every male householder had to make a public declaration. My household and I are in full support of our brother Mr. Hales and the stand he is making. After most had pledged their loyalty, we sat in awkward silence, waiting for the stragglers. It was clear nobody would be moving from their seats until every married man had sworn allegiance. Eventually, there was just one person left. It was excruciating. 150 brethren stared at him in silence, knowing his family's future hung in the balance. Sorry, it's not funny, but finally, after a pregnant pause, he too swore fealty to Bruce Hales Jr. We breathed a sigh of relief. I mean, it's really like, it's not funny, but when you look back at the absurdity of it.
Yeah. And it's important, again, this story is important to tell, as all these stories are, because that was the Mayo 3 letter, right, Craig, which has been talked about many times, and Cheryl can share the link and that sort of thing. But, 2003 feels like a long time ago now, over 20 years ago. And yet that was a massive test of fellowship globally for all the brethren. It was a real power display of Bruce saying, here's a bar, I want to see you all jump over it or you're dead. And everybody jumped over it. And that, again, the younger generation, those who are 20 or younger, even 30 or younger, they might not remember this, but for everybody who's 30 or older, we profoundly remember that fear and that test, and knowing that our lives and our families were on the line with that. Like, my dad stuck that letter to our fridge. It was on the fridge for months, and it had
it was on our fridge too.
Was it? I think that's what we were encouraged to do, to display it in a prominent place in our homes.
And on the notice boards at the meeting rooms.
It was on the notice boards at the meetings. Yeah. And like, my dad had highlighted things that were relevant to us kids. I think it was sideburns and digital cameras. And I don't think any of us were exposing our midriffs, but yeah, it was really scary. And for all the householders, like that poor man, whoever it was, who you just described, he must have been having an internal wrestle to not just jump to straight away. And he must have been sitting there going, what are going to be the costs if I don't? And then submitting.
Yeah.
It was, we referred to it as the Mayo 3. Like, it was like a Brethren 9/11. We're just referring to the date, people knew what you were talking about. And there are very few things that happen in life that are important enough to be known just by their date. But in the Brethren, Mayo 3 was one of those things.
What a thing for a leader to do, though. You think of making a mark like that, a stamp that much that is etched in everybody's mind. I mean, again, we're talking about cults and cult leaders like this that can take something and have everybody jump over that bar, right?
Yeah.
And then it's etched in everybody's brain as this experience of fear and submission. Like, he's got them. He has them in his palm of his hands.
And like, just in case someone's thinking, oh, that was only, that was 20 years ago, he wouldn't do that now. Okay, it wasn't on a global scale, but in New Zealand, was it only last year, Craig, that he suddenly last minute announced a decree that everybody should attend meetings with him in Palmerston North, everybody who was able-bodied, and all of a sudden there's brethren up and down the country dropping tools, closing the schools, cancelling their business meetings and having to close their businesses for a period of several days, and everybody having to travel and flock to Palmerston North. just because he said, like, he can do that. He
An
can flex.
extraordinary
Bend
power
it.
move.
Yeah.
And I think as well, like in the context of the Mayo 3 letter, um, John Hales had only died in January 2002. And so in May 2003, Bruce Hales, who would have been what, 49 at that point, was still like really fresh in his leadership of the Exclusive Brethren. And so this was like, we'd been going through that point, and there were what they would call rival leaders and people questioning whether he was the right person to be the man of God and so on. And so this letter, 15 months after his father died, was like this massive line in the sand where he basically demanded that all the brethren worldwide swear loyalty to him or get out. And it just really emphasized, I think, that there was no scope for disagreement, no scope for challenging. Um, and when you look at, I assume you have it somewhere, Cheryl, like Bob Thorncroft's letter raising concerns about Bruce Hales and Sydney and how he had been interacting with his father and why Bob Thorncroft didn't think he was fit for leadership. I mean, Bob Thorncroft probably got withdrawn from. Uh, and again, I'd say to people, like, what would happen if you stood up and questioned Bruce Hales? And if the answer is you get withdrawn from, then that is not normal.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Anyway, the rest of this chapter deals with the massive shift under Bruce Hales and the return to business and the rollout of their technology. I'll just read the end of it. Bruce Hales Jr. may have been obsessed with restoring some aspects of his father's legacy, but he was happy to disregard others when it became clear that technology was essential for doing business in the 21st century. John had repeatedly told the church that computers were evil, but that rule went out the window in mid-2007 when Statcom, this was a precursor to UBT, began releasing brand new Brethren-controlled computers that came pre-installed with tight restrictions. Known as the WordX 1500, they were provided to members through a similar lease arrangement to those of fax machines and car phones. And they were highly restricted. Emailing was permitted, while all other internet access was blocked. If a company required a particular program for the running of their business, a church representative had to temporarily unlock the system so the program could be installed once it was approved. Limited internet access, a whitelist of websites, mostly banks, airlines, and government agencies, was allowed when WordX 2000 machines with upgraded security protocols were rolled out a few months later. In October 2007, mobile phones were finally permitted, once again with extortionate rental fees. Over the following year, Brethren businesses were able to pay a fee to have industry-specific websites added to their whitelist. By the beginning of 2009, as I prepared to make my escape, they were launching their own websites. The Brethren explained away such shifts in doctrine by saying that times had changed. The Lord has turned a corner. Between ourselves, we sometimes joke that the Lord must surely be dizzy from making so many turns. And just a few points there. Like BDH is like obsessed with his father and how his father was mistreated, his father's legacy. But I think that when it comes down to it, I don't think he actually really gives a shit what his father's ministry was. Uh,
Yeah. Well, he's happy to sacrifice absolutely anything, including his father's ministry, on the altar of making financial progress, really.
Yeah.
hmm. um,
It is shocking and fascinating, and it's so good to have all that in a book here. Like, I was working for Aspect Interiors in Auckland at the time of those Statcom phones being rolled out, so around, I don't know what it was, 2006, 7. And yeah, so Aspect Interiors was a business modeled after Hales's company and run by the Auckland elders, and so, and I can remember, as you know, a run-of-the-mill office girl, part of their wee empire there, I got assigned to do hours and hours of typing up all these Statcom hireage details for families and companies up and down New Zealand. And again, it still didn't make any sense because, like, I was tapping on a typewriter. They didn't have the internet or computers there. So I had a typewriter, with twink, and I made a mistake. But we were all so excited because, my gosh, we were allowed car phones. This was the car phone thing, but it was
Mm.
strictly monitored. Everybody had a number in their car phone, and then they were getting invoiced, and only allowed one car phone per family, and it had to be for business. And, then you'd get these special cases like so-and-so who was an elderly widow who wanted a car phone for safety purposes, and would she be given permission to have one? And
Mm.
all this bonkers stuff, and they were just controlling it all. And I never once questioned, where is that money going? Where is the bank account that this money's going to? I still have no idea. Who was taking all that money? Do you know, Craig?
Well, it was going to Statcom at that point.
Was Statcom a
Where,
legal entity? It was a legal
yes,
entity,
it
wasn't
was. It
it?
was.
Right.
So this explains it pretty well, I think. Fax machines were finally allowed, but like the phones, they had to be rented from Statcom. This technology rollout became a significant revenue generator for the Brethren, with Statcom funds put towards church schools. The fees were extortionate. Our family business paid a monthly charge of $50 for the use of a fax machine when it would have only cost $125 to buy our own.
That is
Um,
unbelievable. What an
And
and there was
absolute
this
rot. What a rot.
But I remember this huge amount of money being creamed off the top, and um, our auntie Marion. Do you remember this, Lindy? So our auntie Marion, who was the youngest sister of my grandpa George and Lindy's nana Anna, I remember her going out and buying her own cell phone because they were not a wealthy family, and she was like, "So you're having to pay your monthly phone charge and then another $50 on top of that to Statcom," and just like, when essentially all that is so that Statcom can control some aspects of your phone. And she's like, well, her point of view was that she was a grandmother and she wasn't doing anything dodgy on her phone, and she just thought she'd save herself $50 by just buying her own little burner phone so that she could keep in touch with her. And it just set off this huge like fuss in the family, because then all the grandkids were like, well, Nana got a non-Statcom phone, so why shouldn't we? And she refused to back down on the doctrine because she thought it was bullshit.
See, that's
And
critical thinking in action, right? You
yes,
guys can do
exactly.
this. Yes.
And she was like, this just makes no sense. It's like, are you saying you don't trust me, an old lady, to like keep myself under control on a mobile phone? Like,
Oh, I love it.
and eventually she got a Statcom phone when one of like her critical questioning of the rule never got addressed. It's just one of her daughters ended up paying for her to have a Statcom phone to make the problem go away so that the grandkids would stop asking about it. But again, they didn't resolve her underlying concern. They just threw some money at it and made it go away, as happens with a lot of things in there. But that technology rollout was ridiculous. I remember when the WordX 1500s come out, you might remember this too, Lindy, and they came with a password, like the administrator.
I'd left by the time any of that computer stuff happened. So that was all pre me. So no, you're informing me.
So these WordX 1500s came out, and they figured out that, oh, you had to get an administrator to unlock them. And then someone figured out that they had never removed the default password for logging into these WordX 1500s, and the default password was password. Uh, and, this, and this news that ripped through the young people in the Brethren in New Zealand, that you could basically crack open these Brethren computers by entering password as the password, at which point it was like open slather and you'd have like full internet access. It was like, never in my life have I seen a technology patch rolled out as quickly as the one that fixed that. But I think it just kind of demonstrated that the Brethren had this massive control, but at the same time they were running like what in retrospect I now recognize was a totally Mickey Mouse operation. Like they didn't really know what they were doing. They were just like these really fumbling attempts to try and figure out how to integrate into the modern world while retaining those elements of control. And they've really, over the last 20 years, more than 20 years now, fine-tuned how some of that control works. So it's a very sophisticated operation now with the UBT devices.
Mm.
So now we're up to chapter 12, which is the chapter that deals with me actually leaving the Brethren. And we'll just skip through some of the key points of this chapter. Obviously, there's a lot of talk. Just the beginning, though. In mid-2009, I was leaving the exclusive Brethren. My siblings had been removed from the family home, where I continued to live with my parents in deathly silence, waiting for the axe to fall. The house was as neat as a pin without 9 people constantly passing through it. No banging doors, no piano playing, and no children's voices raised in argument or play. I would walk down the hallway past cold bedrooms that had been cleaned of my siblings' day-to-day belongings. Members of the church had flowers delivered to Mum with sympathetic notes, feeling for you at this difficult time and sending much love. It was as though the flowers and silence were part of the funeral for what used to be my life, and the house was in mourning. And just to skip through this, so my siblings, were taken away because they thought I was about to be shut up. Then I wasn't shut up, and then my siblings came back. My 9-year-old sister Bella was crying as she came running through the house and also threw her arms around me, saying, I love you, I always will, I promise. Bella had no concept of excommunication, so she couldn't understand what was happening. Not long before, she had pleaded with me to promise I would never leave her. I'd told her I didn't want to, but explained it could be forced by our parents in the church. She refused to believe that was possible, but they won't, they love you. She was very upset when I tried to explain what it meant when Brethren members were shut up or withdrawn from, banned from seeing their family and friends. But if you're not a Brethren, she said, you'll go to hell and I'll never see you again, not even in heaven. That evening, Bella came to my room 3 times, pleading with me not to go. She cried as I told her I couldn't do anything about the Brethren rules, and she wasn't consoled when I said we could focus on enjoying the time we had left. If you leave, she said, then I'll have to run away because I won't be able to bear not being able to hug you. On her final trip to my room, she asked if I would change my mind if she gave me all the cash from her pocket money savings. I was shocked and replied that it was her love that mattered most. She looked at me with tearful blue eyes. But if I give you $100, will you stay?
Oh, just like so heart crushing because like that's embedded in her. You know what I mean? Like that love that she has for you and isn't able to express it. Like to this day.
And there's that moment sort of in every kid's life in the Brethren where they start to realize what it means to be shut up and withdrawn from. And I don't think she had really come across the concept before this point. She was too young to realize why our grandpas weren't in the picture and too young to have heard of the uncles and aunties that weren't around. And this was sort of the first concrete time that someone that she knew and loved was going to be taken away. And the sort of the crushing realization of that for a young child, where you realize how much is at stake in the Brethren.
Yeah.
Poor girl.
Yeah.
And talking about the all the different attempts the Brethren make to try and keep you in there. On a blustery Tuesday afternoon, I was picked up for lunch by a Brethren husband and wife who had children my age. Barrett and Lily had always been a bit outside the square, and I was intrigued when they took me to a local eatery. The man of God had made clear a few years earlier that restaurant dining was forbidden, but Barrett and Lily were prepared to bend the rules. Over lunch, they asked what my problem was. I said I was gay. They pleaded with me to change my mind as if sexuality was a switch that could be flipped, and told me I should cut off my connections with other gay people. Then they said I should get down on my knees and beg for change. This went on for several hours. The following evening, a waitress from the restaurant was killed in a car crash. She was 19, my age. Barrett triumphantly shared the news with me, saying it was surely a sign from God that I was meant to change my sexuality and stay in the Brethren. I was sickened. I wasn't sure what I believed about God anymore, but I knew one thing. God certainly wouldn't kill a stranger to send me a message. I told Barrett my mind was made up, this time in much stronger terms than I'd used over lunch. It's always shocked me looking back at this belief that the Brethren have that God will go out and kill someone to send a message to you.
Yeah.
There's a massive amount of guilt that can come with that, where you're like, well, maybe if I'd followed the rules, maybe if I did what Bruce Hales said, then that other person over there wouldn't have died in a car crash. Or maybe this wouldn't, that blaming. And it happened so often in there. There would be some terrible tragedy, and then it was always, what's the Lord saying to us? This was not a new thing. Like this was going, even in my great grandmother's diaries through the 70s and 80s. Every time something dreadful happened, Symington would be saying what he thought it meant and what sin had been committed that God was trying to correct people on. But to me, it was particularly egregious in this case that the idea that God would kill a waitress from a restaurant I'd been to the day before, like it was just a really offensive, but also a really strange idea. And certainly for me, crystallized how I felt about their attempts to keep me in the Brethren.
Yeah.
It's sort of hard to know what to
I
pick
think
out
that
from
I
this
wonder if
chapter.
you should read about where they're calling you all those names, where you getting those prank phone calls.
Yes, I can do.
Yeah, 231. Yeah.
My brethren relatives struggled, and some, like Anna, who kept in touch with secret phone calls despite her priestly reprimand, clearly weren't happy with being told to cease contact. Other brethren were much less accepting. As news travelled, I received a string of anonymous phone calls. I was called a faggot and told that God created Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. One prank call was from a group of young men saying they wanted Dick. I hung up and they called straight back, hurling abuse down the phone line for 5 minutes, all kinds of insults about me and gay people in general. When they called a third time, I didn't bother answering. They left a voicemail saying I was a fat ginger bastard. These calls were almost always from blocked numbers, but sometimes I was able to track where they were coming from. It was upsetting to realize cousins were among those shouting abuse.
Yeah. And the reason why I wanted you to read this out was because this is a really big issue that is happening to ex-members from insiders. And I mean, Ben went public with his, right? He had a death threat. And it really, really attacks specifically the gay community. And for Bruce Hales bringing in all this grace and compassion that he was trying to bring in when he took over his dad's leadership role, that does not sound like grace and compassion to me. I don't care if you're anti-LGBTQ, that still should not have, that shouldn't be coming out of members of your group that is the elite group and has this special place in heaven. That language should not be coming out of it. And I have a huge issue with some of the stuff that gets sent to me that these insiders are sending ex-members. And so I really wanted that read out just to reiterate what kind of language comes out of their mouth.
Yeah, and it's uncomfortable even to read it out now because it's so, there's not a point to it. It's just
No.
cruelty.
Yeah.
And I think, there's in the Brethren, as I see it, there is this lack of compassion and this lack of ability to form these proper human connections with people, these proper emotional bonds. And like everything is sacrificed, as I see it, to serving the man of God. And then that lack of compassion can come around full circle and become just outright cruelty really quickly.
Yeah.
And when I think about like the complete lack of compassion that we had for people who weren't part of our group, and the way we looked at poor people, and the way we looked at people from different cultures, and the way we treated animals. And there's been an episode of this podcast talking about animal cruelty, but that kind of thing was just regarded, it was funny to people in there.
Yeah.
And you go on to say
to-
in here, and this is on page 233, when you left and, you're told that the world's a cold place, right? And then you get out there and you say Kiwi society was full of strangers who opened their hearts and homes to offer practical and emotional support. Many were horrified by my ordeal, and news traveled quickly. Dozens of congregants from the queer-friendly Auckland Community Church signed a card sending support and prayers. God loves you as you are. That's what grace and compassion looks like.
Yeah, and this was all from people that I didn't know at all. And it was just a really stark split screen happening against the name calling and sort of the abuse that was coming from people inside the Brethren. And bearing in mind, I hadn't spoken publicly about the Brethren at this point. I'd only just left. There was no reason for people inside the Brethren to be targeting me other than that they wanted to and they thought it was funny. And this has happened to so many other people who have left and spoken out. Actually, whether or not they've spoken out, this has happened to so many people who have left, who are just trying to go about their lives, trying to build a new network, a new community. And you've got all these brethren serving this utter shit. And it's particularly difficult for people who are still living in smaller towns or communities where they're seeing brethren every day and you're being shouted at on the street or laughed at in the supermarket or, stuff thrown onto your property, all of these things that have happened to so many people. There's nothing remotely Christian and there's nothing remotely compassionate about how the brethren act towards people who have left. And the brethren all say, this is, mostly it's done by young people and it's not what represents our values and so on. But the way that young people in the brethren act with no filter is really a reflection, I think, of what everybody thinks behind the scenes. But as you get a bit older in the brethren, you realize that you need to put this veneer on your behavior to look acceptable. And so
they
I think,
hear it from somewhere. Those kids hear it from somewhere. They go to schools
exactly.
that they're not in the public's eye. They hear it from somewhere.
And it's certainly not from outside of the brethren.
No.
Nobody outside of the brethren is telling them to hate and
because
abuse
that
people
kind
who
of
leave.
attitude is not accepted out here.
And so I think like the way that young or younger people in the brethren behave is the truest indicator of the underlying behaviors in the church.
Yeah.
Yes, skipping through page 234. I found it helpful to talk to others who had left the brethren and understood what I was going through. I discovered a whole network of former brethren brought together by shared hope and grief. Some were recent leavers and others had been out for more than 50 years, but they all had similar stories of the agony of losing their families. I started finding excommunicated aunts, uncles, and cousins who had walked a path similar to my own. It was an overwhelming relief to know I had relatives on the outside, although not all of them were welcoming. Grandpa Brian, my dad's dad, out of the brethren for more than 30 years, wasn't interested in having regular contact with me. He and his second wife agreed to a single meeting on the condition I didn't reach out again, and for one strange afternoon we quizzed each other. It was bizarre to meet someone who looked exactly like my father, yet felt like a stranger. You can ask any questions you like, my Grandpa Brian said, but this will be your only chance. It took much longer for me to feel comfortable reaching out to my other grandpa, George Hayward. My whole life I'd heard about what a bad person he was, and I struggled to move past that. As a teen, when I'd asked brethren about him, they'd warned me not to trust his friendly overtures. A priest had even quoted from the book of Psalms, "Smooth were the smoky words of his mouth, but his heart was war." I also knew that George was still deeply religious, which made me worried about how he would react to my sexuality. But after a few months, I bit the bullet and searched the phone directory for his number. There was no need for an introduction. He knew exactly who I was. When I told him I was gay, I could almost hear him shrug over the phone. "I can live with that," he said. He added that life had taught him everybody had different viewpoints and we'd all get on a lot better if we accepted that. When I visited Wellington, Grandpa George and I headed to McDonald's for our first meal together. At the time, I didn't fully appreciate how significant this breakfast was to George. I was the first of his children or grandchildren he'd shared a meal with for 28 years. An older man, almost 70, he wore a thin woolen waistcoat vest and rimmed glasses, and he had a twinkle in his eyes that I recognized immediately. It was like looking into a mirror. His voice, too, sounded familiar, and those childhood comments, "Isn't Craig just like George?" clicked into place. As we pushed our hash browns around at the fast food joint on Wellington's Taranaki Street, Grandpa and I agreed we had no regrets in leaving the Brethren. Before we headed off, I gathered my rubbish and crammed it into the cup, as I always do, to make it as small as possible. I looked over at Grandpa and realized he was doing exactly the same thing. Our eyes met and we laughed. It was eerie to have so much in common with a stranger. Those missing puzzle pieces, isn't it?
Mm.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I had no concept of what that meant to Grandpa at that point. So strange looking back. Of course, it
Yeah.
was a massive, massive emotional deal for him to have a meal with one of his kids or grandkids for the first time in 28 years.
Wow.
Um,
Yeah.
but
And that beautiful little reflection of you guys doing the exact same thing with your cup. Like,
yeah,
I'm sure everybody who has met up with family, even family they've never met before, has had those moments where there's like a little family idiosyncrasy, a little genetic thing pop out, and it's like, oh my gosh, like this is crazy.
yeah, and then it makes me like, what did I miss out on by not having a relationship with my grandpa for the first 20 years of my life
Right.
when we were so alike and our experiences had been so similar and for the time that we had until he died, I found his advice, he was always so wise and so insightful, as you experienced as well, Lindy. And
Yeah,
he was just such a good, solid person to have in your life with advice and reflections,
yeah,
and he was so like that critical thinking that we were talking about earlier. Like
mm,
Grandpa and I like probably disagreed on more than we agreed on. Um,
mm.
like we lived very different lives, but still like he was always prepared to come to the table and have a conversation and meet you where you were.
Yeah,
Um,
with like a calm center, not being defensive or yeah, having to shove his agenda down your neck or whatever. Like he was a calm, wise person, and the facts are that you missed out on all those years of having a loving
mm,
grandfather in your life. Like it's wonderful that you guys reunited, but that
mm.
loss is yeah,
And then I think like, all of the trauma that we went through in our childhood with my dad's mental health and so on, it's like what a
yeah,
difference it would have made if we'd had this calm, wise grandfather
yeah,
there.
yeah,
Um,
totally.
but he knew how to share his point of view without pushing it down your throat. And it would always be, this is how I feel, and I'm not telling you how to feel this way, but
Yeah.
you tell me how you feel, and then like we'll go through it and see. And we would have all sorts of discussions, and he would never reject what your point of view was. He would say that's an interesting perspective, and that's not one that I can see myself reaching at this point, but I'll go away and I'll have a think about it and I'll do some more reading on the topic and then I'll see. And sometimes he would, and he'd come back and say, I've been doing some more thinking and research on what we talked about, and he would adjust his thinking based on that.
That's
Mm,
Um,
mm,
incredible, like absolutely freaking incredible. Because that's what I yearned. Like I can't even tell you, man, my whole entire just yearned for those elders that are there that you can look up to that have exactly what you're explaining. Could you imagine what a difference as a child to be able to just fall into the arms of something like that and to be able to, I mean, I always go back to the book, The Body Keeps the Score, right? Can you imagine what a difference it would make in the record inside our bodies of our trauma if we had that kind of eldership and leadership to always fall on? How safe and comfortable of a human we would grow into to know that dialogue, two people can have opposing views, but it's still in this place of safety.
mm.
mm,
To me, like that's what I mean. I always go back to churches were created for that kind of thing. When you're struggling, you have somewhere to go. You have somewhere to go to talk and converse about the struggles you're having with people that understand a different level of seeing things outside in the big picture. You know what I mean? It's absolutely cruel what the doctrine of separation takes away from people.
Mm.
I'm just skipping through this chapter if there are any other bits you
Oh,
think we need to highlight.
it's a painful chapter. It's a deeply painful chapter
mm,
of you describing those terrible, terrible, terrible last few weeks in the family home. And yeah, again, those of us who have been through it can identify so deeply with living in that awful place, where yeah, you're waiting for the axe to fall, for you to be forced out, or for, you know, something to happen to cut that final cord. That, and sometimes it feels like nobody can go through with it, because you can't go through with it, because who of us can bear to, you know, finally you know, say goodbye, when it is like watching, you know, your impending execution unfold in front of you, right? And waiting for a date, or waiting for something, some sort of death knell to finally be served, so that to make it happen. And then your family on the other hand as well, that, you know, you describe on page 237, you know, your mum just sobbing, living in this terrible place of knowing that you're about to go and that they may never see you again. It's horrendous. But yeah, then you do go on and yeah.
And even
You
the when you describe going back home, right, to get the rest of your things, and Bella, oh my goodness, like this one, when Bella saw me, she burst into tears. Dad was holding her arms behind her back to stop her from running to me. We stood there sobbing. I told her over and over that I loved her. I reminded her of the promise we'd made, that we'd always love each other no matter what. I asked Dad if I could hug her goodbye, but he said definitely not. Like it's just, God, it's just so heart-wrenching, because every single one of us can relate to having to go back home after you leave to get your things. I mean, I had to, and I was met with a priest who was just screaming at me. And all I wanted to do was just sit there and hold them all. You know, it's the last time that you're ever going to have an encounter like that, right? It's just, it's hard.
mm.
It's just, it's sad. It's gut wrenching.
I just don't think you ever get over it, really, do you?
You definitely don't. I think you learn how to walk with it. And those that get fueled by it, you can put it into action, right? You could definitely put that grief into action. And I think that's why I'm so on this survey that Jill Mitten has put together, is because we need this data. We need these surveys to be done. We need more of them from the ex-brethren community, because we've got to find ways to fight this thing and have these changed, some laws change, to help those inside that cannot see. They don't see this. They're relying on our voices and what it is that we are doing out here. So for myself, I mean, I obviously take time with my grief, but I definitely put my grief to use.
Mm, yeah.
And I
There
do,
has to be a why.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that grief, when you hold your grief, it puts you into this state of utter compassion all the time, right? Grief has a way of doing that, of putting us into the state of compassion when we're listening to other people. It puts us into, it allows us to listen differently, right? Our hearts are hurting. And when our hearts hurt and we're using that fuel to help others, it allows us to encompass and hold and be able to see what that other person can be going through. And I think it's when grief is stuffed and it becomes bitter and it becomes resentful, or it becomes this angry machine, right? That's when it becomes destructive, right? But if you can pick it up and you hold it and you know why it's there, I don't even blame Bruce Hales. I really don't, because he's just following what he's learned, right? I mean, that's their whole family is this power. It's just a power play, right? But he's only playing out what he has been taught and what he's seen, right? All of this just stems over and over and over, right? But still, you know, a spade needs to be called a spade, right? That's how when we put it out on the table in black and white, that's how people are able to see through this. It's just, it hurts.
It's,
My heart hurts. But you can have a heart that hurts and still make it work for you. You've got to learn how to walk with those hurts.
It's easier said than done.
It is, yeah. I still do therapy every 2 weeks. There's a reason for that, right? Like it's you have to find always those silver linings. You got to find a way to breathe through it. You've always got to find, for me, it's purpose. It's always finding the purpose in this pain. There's no other book. This book, like I can't even tell you, Craig, I did so much healing when I read this book because it was so, and I know I said this on the last podcast, there's so much heart in it.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate it, Cheryl. And I really wanted it to be a book for all of us, not just me. I'm struggling to know what what to pick out of this chapter because every sentence is like
it's hard. How do you pick it's impossible just to pick some pieces out of this chapter. Yeah.
But where the chapter finishes, again, it's something I think we can all identify with, where you said you heard that you'd been withdrawn from, and again there was some ridiculous stuff there with the technicalities of language that was used as they tried to say it, so the blame was resting on your shoulders that you had chosen to leave, which is like, it's a
just to interject there, many years after I left, I heard a really funny explanation for why this language had come about. They didn't want to say that they'd withdrawn from me. So there'd been an assembly meeting where they talked about what to do about my matters, and one of the local brothers, who was a bit of a hothead, had jumped in this assembly meeting and said that they should withdraw from me. And the meeting didn't agree, but he went ahead and announced that he was withdrawing from me anyway. But only one of his sons said amen, and there was a silence in the rest of the hall. But what it meant was that when they came to withdraw from me for real, they couldn't say they were withdrawing from me because that would mean that his withdrawing from me had been bullshit all along.
Oh my gosh.
And they had these like conferences, it had turned out, where they tried to get him to retract that he had withdrawn from me so that they could whistle it through the assembly properly. BDH got involved, as I understand it, and he refused to retract his withdrawing of me, which meant that when they withdrew from me for real, they couldn't use that language. Like they had to find some way of like threading the needle to get through the politics of it.
That is so ridiculous. Wow.
But again, these are like the pieces of context that sometimes you don't find out for 10 years until someone else leaves and fills you in on that really weird thing that happened. But anyway, so I'll just read the last paragraph.
Well, like the last paragraph's really, really powerful, really poignant, and again, all of us can identify with it. It's just a really beautiful and poignant and sad way of describing what it feels like to go through this process.
So this is immediately following the conversation with the priest to say that I'd been not withdrawn from, but withdrawn from. I was past caring about brethren technicalities. Just as Grandpa George had all those years earlier, I felt a heavy weight come off me. It was as though my life had been a block of stone that had crumbled into sand in my hands. I'd been furiously trying to stop it from slipping through the cracks, but now I forced open my clenched fists and watched as the last few grains were carried away. I was finally free.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I just savor in that, right? Like it's just
and I think you grieve every grain of sand as it flies away.
You do. Grief therapy is a very good tool to have in your back pocket. I used to go to all these every kind of group therapy I could find my hands, because it was just it was something I just wanted to be able to find a way to navigate because it was so overwhelming. And you know, even though we have our freedom, you do have to navigate the grief. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's that process of letting go and having open, empty hands for some time before you can pick up new things.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Craig.
Thank you both again for coming on. Yeah, I really, I know these are long podcasts, guys, but they're so worth sitting down and listening to for the content that's in there. And I'm grateful for all the insiders that have reached out to the three of us that have gotten so much from Craig narrating parts of his book. I know it's really helping you guys. So thank you to all the insiders that are listening. Remember to like, comment, make sure you're subscribed, and we will be back for part 3. Thank you so much, Lindy. Thank you, Craig.
Sounds great. Great to see you all. Yeah, looking forward to the last part.
Yeah. Until next time, much love to everybody. Bye-bye.
How can you support Get a Life podcast? You can donate internationally via PayPal at www.paypal.me/getalifepodcast. PayPal also has a QR code that can be scanned. Or donate to our Get a Life podcast GoFundMe. If you're in a high-demand religious group and need help, please go to oliveleaf.network. To share your story or be a guest on the show, email info.getalife@proton.me. Check out www.get-a-life.net for Get a Life merchandise, books, and ways to support or get support. Please remember to like this video, subscribe to Get a Life, and comment.